Good evening. We apologize for the delay. We were just wrapping up an executive session, so thank you for your patience. Welcome to tonight's study session of the City Council. Agendas for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found by visiting Broomfield's website at broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes 3 study session items. Seeing there are no concept reviews on the agenda this evening, there will not be any public comment. The study session will be televised on Channel 8 and through live streaming on Broomfield's website. For our hearing impaired residents present, we have wireless headsets available through our AV team in the back of the council chambers. We wanted to note we're having technical difficulties with a few of the council chamber monitors this evening, and we apologize for the inconvenience. We've brought out the big wall, so hopefully you'll still be able to see the presentations. And again, our apologies. We can all just try to deal with it. Our first study session item this evening is a discussion regarding the wastewater reclamation facility master plan. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, council and community. You can see in the back there, we have representatives from each one of our public works teams and divisions. Equally anticipating tonight. This has been many years in the works, and Ken Rutt, our illustrious Public Works Director, is going to walk us through this item. Mr. Rutt.
Well, good evening, Mayor and council members and Manager Hoffman. Thank you for the opportunity to come tonight to present the wastewater master plan. I'm Ken Rutt, the Director of Public Works. And we'll start off with some introductions. Assisting tonight will be our project manager is Rhonda Joe Ackerman from our Capital Improvements Division, and Jeff Berline from Carollo Engineering, who's our consultant engineer on this project. So next slide. Tonight we're going to talk, go over the master plan overview, the future needs and future regulations, our capital improvement program, and sustainability and water resilience, and how we're going to plan those out over the next 15 years. Next slide. So for me, this is actually my third wastewater master plan that I have gone through. And the first one was in 1999. And then that was followed up with 2011, and then this one here in 2023. So it's a pretty neat experience to have gone through and saw the different changes as we have grown as a community. Back in 1999, we were, I think at that point, just about 42,000 people. So slightly different from today. Next slide. So what does the city have to have a master plan for? And one of the major pieces of the wastewater overall management is to make sure that we comply with the Clean Water Act. That's where it starts. Clean Water Act specifies that all wastewater agencies need to have a planning document under the 208 section of the Clean Water Act. Which EPA has delegated the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment as the approval authority for all wastewater treatment master plans, facilities, treatment plants, lift stations, anything associated with wastewater treatment. So our wastewater plan our modifications and future development must align with this master plan as the state reviews each one of our submittals throughout the next 10 years. Upon approval by City Council, the wastewater utility plan has to be submitted to the North Front Range Water Quality Planning Association, who is our 208 planning approval. And they do everything from basically Broomfield all the way up to Wellington. So most of Weld County, Larimer County, and Broomfield County. Then Colorado Department of Public Health will use this plan to approve any of our upcoming projects. Next slide. So Broomfield is both the our land management agency, and also the wastewater operating agency. So those are the two main pieces of why we are required as a city and county to develop these master plans. As I said before, the last wastewater utility plan was done in 2011. And then this plan will summarize our current and future needs like capacity, regulations, assets needed for replacement. We've developed a capital improvement plan and a phasing plan to go with that, and the adoption and approval from city council allows implementation of these improvement projects. We also have incorporated our city and county of Broomfield sustainability goals and greenhouse gas reductions. Next slide. So the wastewater service area for Broomfield is our boundaries. So we're responsible to ensure that everything within our boundaries has opportunity to be served with wastewater services. Next slide. And the little blue outline there shows the location of the current wastewater treatment facility, which is located off of 124th and Lowell, just to the east, about a half a mile. If you take that road, you run smack right into it. So next slide. And that's an overview of the current facility, which if you take a moment and take a look at that, and you can see that there's still quite a bit of green space. By the end of the presentation, you will see that there isn't any green space for the facilities needed. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to cut to the end of the presentation and give you the good news up front, which is the cost of the program, the project. The project is roughly $124 million. It's broken up between a capacity, which is about 17% of the cost, asset renewal, which is 20%, biosolids is 18%, reuse is 6%, and the biggest one is the regulatory, unfunded regulatory requirements, which is 39%. Next slide. Go ahead, move on. So what are the drivers that help us determine when we have to do the master plan, and what are the critical components of the waster plan? Well, we have growth and capacity. We have our facility conditions. We have current and future regulation, and then how do we make sure we have water resiliency? And then we do base that off of the expected growth through 2050, and we use the population projections that were provided on June 2023. So they're one of the most current. Next slide. So the wastewater treatment plants are permitted on two different permitting levels. So we have a permitting level that is for the flow or the hydraulic, what's coming into the wastewater plant, which the current plant is at 12 million gallons a day. And then the second piece is what's called organic loading. And that's really the solids portions of what's being treated in the wastewater facility. That's measured by what's called BOD, or biochemical oxygen demand. And it was based on some interesting stuff back in the 1800s. And I think I was reminded at ACE's meeting that that was determined by how long it took the water to flow from London to the bay, which was 5 days. So it's BOD 5 test. So an EPA will not change that. So we're still required to monitor it that way. So the first slide here shows you the hydraulic needs. So based on our projections, we are looking at 2031 being at what's called the 95% trigger. So there's, along with the two permitted measures of flow and organic loading, there's also two regulatory requirements. When we hit 80%, we must be in the planning stages. When we hit 90% or 95% of capacity, we must be in construction. For can't even say that word now. For us, I'm going to skip that word because it's not going to come out. And for City and County of Broomfield, what does that mean? Basically, if we hit that 95% by law, we are not allowed to issue any further building permits until we have started construction. And that is based on not just the average, daily average, but it is based on a average monthly flow. So whatever is the maximum month throughout the permitted cycle, that is what those triggers are based on. And for 2023, which is our max, when we had really 2 months, we had February and May as our 2 biggest months. And we are right just slightly under the 80%. And so we're on target to be where we're supposed to be by law, which is in the planning stages. Next slide. So the next slide shows us the most critical one, which is the organic loading. And we are looking at meeting that capacity where we hit that 95% trigger in 2027. So we're projecting 2027, we must be in construction. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So one of the first things we did was we took a look at the overall condition of the wastewater facility and evaluated what are some of our asset conditions. And generally overall, the plant is in good condition. It's in compliance with all of our current permit requirements. One of the biggest stumbling blocks right now, or bottlenecks, if you might say, is our digestion and its aging. It was built in 1964 and has not been expanded since then. And we have suppressed its capacity. In fact, one of them is failing and not operational at this point. So the digestion in solids handling is one of the major limiting factors. Next slide. And this slide here just shows you the facility assessments, what all the different areas we went through. There's 10 different items identified, running through the different various treatment facility components between primary treatment, preliminary treatment, which is mostly physical parts of treatment. And then you get into the secondary treatment, which is biological. So one of the main things that I don't know if people understand on wastewater treatment is most of the work is done biologically. So basically, in the wastewater industry, sometimes they call this bug farmers, because that's really what we're doing. We're managing the organism population to meet what is coming in as far as the waste concentrations. Next slide. So one of the near-term regulations is a project that we just finished, which was we had to install some supplemental carbon. That project was recently completed. We needed to have it done before the July 1st, 2024 permit limit goes into effect, which reduces our total inorganic nitrogen limit to 14 milligrams per liter. Currently, it is not regulated as a total. All we are monitoring right now, or are we required to meet, is an ammonia standard. So now they've combined ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite to get your total inorganic nitrogen. And just like this fertilizer bag, the first part is ammonia. The second part is phosphorus, no different than wastewater. Most of the concentration coming in is some kind of a nitrogen form. And then phosphorus is another big nutrient that we get. The supplemental carbon project that we just finished and are now operating has allowed us to meet the upcoming 14 milligram per liter. We are averaging right around 10 milligrams per liter right now. One of the major things we needed to do was to make sure that it was online about a year ahead of the permit limit, because temperature throughout the year changes how the organisms react and how the treatment processes react. So we wanted some time to ensure that we were able to predict what those influences might be. And so we started operating it, and it's working outstanding. Basically, it's a supplemental carbon. Basically, it's a form of a sugar, basically. The next one is temperature. That will be a big one, and we'll talk a little bit more about that one. That has a major impact on our costs, as well as the Reg 31 nutrients, PFAS, which is on everybody's mind and in the newspaper a lot. And then the trace organics, microplastics, and nanoparticles, which we have talked about once in a while in the last 12 months. So next slide. So this slide is kind of showing you where we are. The blue dots are what our results have been. The yellow line is our upcoming permit requirement, which begins, like I said, July 1st, 2024, which is 14 milligrams per liter. And then the green line shows the anticipated Reg 31 limits, which is 2.1 milligrams per liter. So we'll be having to drop from 14 to 2 when that regulation comes into effect. As you can see, the blue dots, the last piece where it says March 23 through June 23, you can see that our current treatment is meeting the 14. The red line is our median, and then the purple line was the 95 percentile. All right, next slide. This is just one of the pictures of the upgrade, and what we had to do. What we did was we repurposed a treatment facility that was underutilized when we did our last expansion. So we repurposed that building and saved construction costs and converted that to the carbon feed building. And this slide just shows you beginning when we started the Micro-C, how well the plant has performed. And Corolla was also the design engineer on that process. Next slide. The next major nutrient we have to treat is phosphorus. And the plant has done really well. It's also removed for the most part biologically. We do add some ferric chloride in the influent for two reasons. One, it reduces the hydrogen sulfide releases so that we can reduce odors near our facility. And then secondly, it assists with removal of phosphate. So it helps tie up the phosphorus in the wastewater. And as you can tell, the wastewater treatment facility has been able to meet the Reg 31 standards pretty consistently. So phosphorus doesn't seem to be a major issue at this point, although when the digesters are working, we have some other side treatments that we have to do. Because basically in the anaerobic digestion, your phosphorus is re-released and then you have to retreat it. So that's just part of the biological process. Get up here. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Berlin, and he's going to talk a little bit more about some of the new regs.
Thank you, Council. Again, my name is Jeff Berlin. I work for Corolla Engineers, and our office is in the Interlochen area of Broomfield, where we have 70 employees who do water, wastewater engineering as our only focus. So next slide, please. Ken asked me to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming regulations that the facility will be faced with meeting. And I think when you saw the $524 million in the next 20 years, the capital improvements program, a lot of that, about 40%, was allocated based on the need to meet these regulations. So that's a pretty important thing that the city and county have to prepare for is permit limits. So I want to talk a little bit about a few of those. One of those is effluent temperature. So facilities in Colorado mostly discharge to small creeks and streams, and the state has been adding regulations related to cooling the wastewater, particularly in winter, so that the impacts of that higher temperature discharge are less impactful on the fish and aquatic life in the river. So if you animate one slide, please. What we see here is this orange line is the trend of wastewater temperature through the year. And what you see is that the wastewater that we discharge is warmer in summer and cooler in winter. And that's just mainly related to the fact that your drinking water is warmer in summer, coming from reservoirs, ambient exposure, and it's cooler in winter. Unfortunately, the fish expect in their development is based on the fact that they have cyclical temperature in the streams themselves. And so the gray line is the proposed permit limit for Big Dry Creek. And that gray line is higher in summer, and currently the plant will comply with the limit in summer. But in winter, the plant is typically above the limit, and by as much as 6 degrees Celsius or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So what that means is that the facility will need to cool the wastewater a significant amount in winter. And if you animate the next slide, please, that will mean the addition of things that are normally shown at power plants and other industrial facilities for cooling water, something like a cooling tower for cooling the water. Next slide, please. Another thing that is coming in the future is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. In the industry, we call these PFAS generically. There are a huge number of these compounds. The thing that they have in common is that they are essentially organic compounds with long chains of carbon with a fluorine atom or multiple fluorine atoms in them. You have heard them in the media referred to as forever chemicals. And the reason for that is that they generally they were designed and created for purposes such that they do not break down. They have very unique properties, which has spurred their use in a lot of things. We're probably all touching or wearing something that has PFAS compounds in them. And so that's really a place where we're at. In fact, just this week, a letter from the industry at large was sent to the administration to identify the fact that these PFAS compounds are ubiquitous and they come into our environment. And at the wastewater treatment facility, it's an exceedingly challenging place to remove them. So there is an effort to focus on source control instead of treatment and removal of these compounds. So next slide, please. And just to give you a background, the amount of PFAS in relative things that people have exposure to, biosolids is the highest concentration that they are in wastewater. So that's the disposal to land application where they concentrate in the biosolids. But what you see here is that the relative ranges in parts per trillion are much higher in many other places that we come into contact with them. Food packaging, makeups, things like dental floss and other non-stick devices. These all have PFAS compounds in them. One of the PFAS compounds that you may have heard of is Teflon, for instance. Okay. So what we know, if you animate the next slide, please, is that we are uncertain how limits will be applied to wastewater and biosolids. We know that EPA is moving forward with applying limits to drinking water, the potable water consumption for human health. Those are in progress. And because Big Dry Creek is downstream a drinking water source, many other limits are promulgated into the wastewater facility based on protecting downstream drinking water. So PFAS is certainly something of concern and something that the facility is preparing to be aware of treating if the limits come in the future. Next slide, please. So other future regulatory concerns, these are on the radar. These are things that people are hearing about and interested in. Pharmaceuticals, personal care products, microplastics and nanoparticles. All of these are down the road going to be likely to have permit limits that the facility needs to meet. And the facility has to be prepared to add treatment processes to remove these potential regulatory compounds. Sound good? Next slide, please, for Ken.
So one of the things that at the ACES meeting I brought up was when I started in wastewater 35 years ago, the winter temperature for us generally went down to roughly around 12.8 or so. And now that you see that it is now much higher than that. So it's about roughly about 2.8 degrees warmer than it was about 35 years ago. Many reasons for that. Part is growth, part is other environmental factors. So next slide. So the wastewater master plan has identified 5 different phases for expansion. And the first phase is really where we begin the preparation for the whole, the next 3 or 4 phases. We have to relocate a few things to put them better in the treatment line to make sure that we're able to facilitate the proper treatment and removal. Because you have to remember, this facility was built in 1954. And as it was expanded, I think 11 times over those years, it doesn't always make sense when we have to use the rest of the facility. So we do have to realign a few treatment processes to make it flow in the proper treatment order. So phase 1 begins most of that improvement. It also expands a few facilities to ensure that, for example, the flow equalization, we're looking at expanding that to ensure the reuse water capacity, and to ensure that the flow that runs through the treatment plant is more consistent. It's like everybody else, you know, it's wastewater bugs like to graze all day rather than be at Thanksgiving dinner and eat a whole lot and then just sleep. That doesn't do us any good. So for wastewater, it's much better if we can consistently feed it. So that's what the flow EQ basin is really a major important factor for that. We also will do some reuse pumping improvements to also assist with capacity during that time, and then optimize our blowers and secondary clarifiers to begin the enhancement of our sustainability processes. Energy use is one of the largest, wastewater plants are one of the largest energy users, and aeration is the largest energy user on the wastewater facility. So improvements we can do in the blowers maximizes our efforts to reduce the carbon footprint. Next slide. Phase 2 is in the yellow, and that's where we start expanding some capacity to meet our requirements for 2027, and that is increasing our secondary treatment processes and some of our digestion complex. So we'll be able to upgrade the digesters now that we've moved a process out of the way. If you can see where most of the number 11s, 12s, 16, and 18 are at the bottom of the graph there, that was all where the flow equalization basin was set at. So now it will flow in the proper sequence. And then next slide. Phase 3 is in the green, and that's where we'll be. One of the major components of a wastewater permit is we must provide a secondary energy source. We do that through generators. And so we'll be adding some additional generation capacity to make sure that if Xcel ever loses power to the plant, which does happen, that we were able to continue treating the wastewater. Wastewater doesn't stop. It flows 24/7. It may increase from time to time, but it's never stopped. So if we were to plug it up to prevent it from going out, it will just back up to your houses. And we don't want to do that. So wastewater flows all the time. We also be expanding our disinfection treatment capabilities. And part of the nutrient improvements is how we recycle our internal flows. And then also some side stream when we, like I said earlier, when we begin to do complete anaerobic digestion, it does release phosphorus and we have to do a side stream treatment to remove it. And that will be added during that time. And then we have identified a space if PFAS treatment becomes something that the wastewater facility will have to do. Next slide. Phase 4. We're looking at some solids loadout, some the temperature, cooling towers, some hydraulic capacity, and some asset improvements, as well as some flow improvements and odor control. And finally, our reuse pumping improvements to finalize the reuse capacity. Next slide. And then the last slide is where we do the tertiary. My mouth is dry. Denitrification filters and phosphorus removal filters. And that will help us get to that 2.01 milligrams per liter. Basically, our stream standard is because we are the first wastewater facility on Big Dry Creek. There is nobody ahead of us, and there is very limited flow from Stanley Lake during the wintertime. Basically, our permit standards are the stream standards because we do not get to dilution. And even though it says dilution is not the solution, it helps with permit limits. So next slide. That just shows you the complete, all 5 phases together. As you can see now with the highlighted areas, the amount of green space has drastically changed. And the facility is designed to go through about 125,000 folks, which will carry us through 2050. Next slide. So our capital improvement schedule and key considerations. Like I said, the first phase again is site preparation. Second is the capacity drivers, performance, resource recovery. Third is our timing of the growth, asset upgrades, reuse approach. And then it'll be based on some of the timing of the PFAS limits. Fourth phase again is continuation of finalizing the growth, our treatment approach for temperature limits, and then the timing of Reg 31 limits and approach we will use for treatment. One of the important factors is that Broomfield participated in a program that the state implemented in 2018, I believe it was, where they are allowing us, if we meet certain treatment standards, they're providing us an extra year of compliance in order to build some of these facilities. And so we're able to capture additional compliance schedule timelines through our treatment of our phosphorus right now. As the slide said earlier, our phosphorus has been in compliance since 2018, and we've been able to capture an extra year of compliance schedule with the phosphorus for each of those years. The state allows up to 10 years. They allow 7 years for any one parameter. So you have the 2 parameters, one's phosphorus and one is nitrogen. And so we're able to right now capture year for year right now with phosphorus, and with the addition of the supplemental carbon, we are anticipating to be able to gather 2 or 3 additional years. And that's why some of these have been phased down a little bit farther to take advantage of that compliance schedule. Otherwise, phase 5 and particularly phase 5 would have to be pushed way up in schedule. But because we were able to participate and earn those credits, we were able to push some of those costs down slightly. And staff has done an outstanding job in making that happen. Next slide. So from if you want to look at it from a spreadsheet calendar, we're looking at phase 1 going into design. We're hoping to present a contract amendment for Carollo to begin the design on phase 1. I think at the October 22nd council, 24th council meeting. And that'll begin that phase. It will take about 9 months to get the site application and process design review from the state. So the state is takes a time, right? So once we begin, we'd be able to do the site application fairly early in the process, but the design review has to be at a later stage based on the completeness of the design. And then they'll be able to begin that review process. I believe it's 60% before they even look at it. And so at 60%, we'll start submitting a design review and then be negotiating with the state back and forth on any questions. So that's about a 9-month process. And then we are construction is about a 15 to 18-month process on this first phase. And then about another, it'll take us about a year to do all the commissioning of that facility, and that'll take us to 2027. And then moving through the next phases, kind of at the tail end of each other phase. So we'll begin design as we're under construction of phase 2 and so forth throughout all the phases. Next slide. So the key pieces here is that we have to submit our chemical approvals prior to our permit expiring, which expires December 31st of 2024. If we do not do that, once our permit expires and it's administrative extended, they will not provide us any approvals. They cannot approve an amended permit or a administrative extended permit. It has to be an active permit. And so come December 31st, we have to have some of this information submitted to the state to begin that approval process. Right now, chemical approvals are about 9 months to get those approvals. Even though we are using pretty much most of the chemicals that they have to get reapproved every permit cycle. We do have a couple additional ones that we'll be submitting on that go with the side stream treatment. So that'll be a 9-month process. Secondly, again, just a reminder that the capacity is the organic. And what's critical about that is, as we've seen water conservation, right? So dilution is not the solution, right? So if we conserve a lot of water, particularly internal use, it increases the concentration of the wastewater. So back in the 80s and 90s, that concentration from an engineering perspective was about 0.17 pounds per person. It is now 0.23 pounds per person. So that's a significant increase where you see that's why our organic loading is hitting first in 2027, is because it's a calculation based on how much your flow times the weight of water times the concentration of the organic material coming in. So that's how they calculate the organic load. So particularly as we build, one of the consequences obviously of multifamily units is you're putting more people in smaller areas, and concentration in that smaller area is higher. Apartments traditionally don't use as much water as single family homes. And so you have a higher concentration. And not that it's good or bad, it's just, that's what it is. And that's what's driving some of these factors as we move forward. Next slide. Again, that's just a review of some of the costs we did. We broke out construction from design and permitting costs. And it comes out to that roughly 5.24 million or $524 million. Next slide. Oops, there we go. 524. All right. So what's driving some of the cost increases? Because you probably heard last year, wastewater expansion was going to be about $150 million. So why did it go from 150 to 524? Well, a couple of reasons. One is when they did Carollo didn't do this, it was somebody else that did the cost estimate. Obviously, you're looking at what you know at the time without actually doing a facility evaluation. So once you go through the facility evaluation, you identify additional areas that need to be addressed. And then there's been some regulatory updates and finalizations over the last 12 months or 18 months that have brought the picture into a clearer view. So when you put all that together, and then you have construction cost increases, if you look in this table on 2020, you can see a high spike of the construction costs for wastewater industry. That it was pretty steady, a steady climb from 2004 to 2020, and then there was almost a doubling in 2020.
Mr. Rudd, if I may really quickly, this is one of the learning lessons for asset management. So one of the reasons that cost is so high, when they do the facility review based on it's just like anything else. It's going to cost more if you haven't done the maintenance. So when they came in and looked at the facility that hadn't been touched for a really long period of time, and I don't mean touched as in from a maintenance perspective, I mean just overall what those bigger ticket items are to keep it up to date, that really compounded those costs to be so exorbitant was because of the lack of asset management. And that is not something that we want to continue that practice. Continue, Mr. Rupp.
Sure. I think there's one slide. I think there's another piece here. There we go. Just a couple of things that's been in the news, just outlining construction costs and the supply chain and labor. is that you have all these competing outside influences, whether it's chip manufacturing and with the auto industry or other wastewater facilities. Some of it is related to some of the grant funding that a lot of the smaller communities that are underprivileged, they also are building wastewater facilities that are funded through some of their grants that they can gather. And so there's only so many wastewater treatment facility contractors, particularly ones that can handle this large of a project. I think you're really looking at about 5 to 6 contractors that can handle this type of a project. And so you do have increased costs because everybody else is kind of in the same ballpark. Now Westminster is going out for their master plan. Greeley is looking at expansions, Longmont, Loveland, Boulder. Just about everybody's in the same boat because everybody along the Front Range in Colorado has pretty much the same issues. And we all have to meet the same requirements for the most part. Next slide. Sustainability. Let Jeff talk a little about.
Yeah, so as Ken mentioned, the facility has all these drivers coming: capacity, asset renewal, and the regulations. And one of the ways we looked at to approach this sustainability, this project from a sustainability standpoint, was to evaluate the current level of greenhouse gas emissions from the facility, look at ways to optimize that, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, improve energy efficiency. But at the same time, sustainability is about more than greenhouse gas emissions. It is about using assets to achieve their life cycle, and it is about modifying things the least amount of times necessary to achieve your ultimate end goal. So one of the things that the phasing of that master plan construction is to touch facilities the minimum amount of times. That's good for cost effectiveness, but it's also good for sustainability of resources and the amount of times you're turning over equipment, the amount of times that the facility staff have to handle the fact that contractors are working in their facility. So to highlight a few sustainability and water resiliency issues, if you could go to the next slide, please. The number one thing that we are doing is achieving treatment that is in line with new regulations designed to protect water quality and public health. We are bringing treatment processes selected to minimize the need for chemical addition. That's desirable for a variety of factors. Chemicals are expensive to purchase. Chemicals are often a safety and health hazard, not just to the community at large in the course of their delivery, but to the plant staff who have to work there every day around those chemicals. For flexibility in the beneficial reuse of biosolids, biosolids are a well-known and good source of nutrients, water, and organic material to farms. And that's one of the things that's excellent that the city and county of Broomfield does, is replenish the farm organic material through the application of biosolids. And another key point is beneficial energy recovery from digester biogas. So Ken mentioned the anaerobic digesters that will be replaced. They generate methane gas. Methane gas can be burned and used in several different manners to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and for just sustainable reuse of a natural product. So we intend to sustainably reuse the biogas in the new construction. That's very important to the city and county in the sustainability goals. And this is a place where the industry is really changing very rapidly due to incentives, federal incentives in sustainable and beneficial biogas or beneficial energy use in overall. And so we have kept our options open as to where we're going to go based on the dramatic changes in federal incentives. But right now it's targeting generation of electricity on site to offset electricity use at the plant. So some key components for those upcoming projects in line with your sustainability goals is the potential for LEED or Envision certification, which is a certification related to sustainability and green construction. The use of LED lighting to reduce lighting costs and bulb replacements. Blower energy optimization. Ken mentioned that the aeration energy is the largest single use of energy at the facility. So optimizing that use is important to reducing the overall energy usage and achieving energy efficiency goals in the design of buildings that we are adding. So next slide, please. So we did a full baseline analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions from this facility. Just as a point of reference, there are 3 types of greenhouse gas emissions based on the way they are studied at large. Those are scope 1, which is direct emissions from the facility. So that's emissions from the treatment processes and combustion on the site. Indirect emissions are scope 2. Those are from purchased electricity and natural gas. And the third is indirect emissions. Those come from purchased materials and end uses like chemicals. So we did a baseline of the facility in 2021 and later adjusted that baseline to 2019 because we understand that the city is doing a citywide 2019 baseline. So then we, next slide, please. As an engineer, I'm required to show lots of charts with numbers. Here's the takeaway. Per unit of wastewater that the facility has treated, in 2019 and 2021, the facility had emissions of 3 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per million gallons of wastewater treated. So the facility treats about 7 million gallons per day. So that was about 21 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per day in 2019 and 2021, a relatively similar process and uses during those years. We have projected the facility forward after the improvements in phase 1 and phase 2. And one of the biggest additions there is the full digestion process with biogas beneficially reused. And that will reduce the unit greenhouse gas emissions by 7%, despite more stringent limits, increased chemical demands, and likely more energy use related to aeration and pumping in these improvements. So we are projecting a reduction in the unit greenhouse gas emissions. The overall greenhouse gas emissions will go up because you will be treating more wastewater and your emissions are related, they're correlated to the amount of flow that is necessary to treat. So this is exciting and very forward thinking of this facility, which is the largest energy user that the city and county of Broomfield operates. So with the next slide, please. So one other thing we're looking at that was in this master plan is this growing relationship between wastewater and water in general. And so one of the things we're preparing for is the long-term resiliency of the water supply. So this is a photo, an aerial image of the Broomfield Department of Public Works and the water treatment facility. And you might say, Jeff, you're a wastewater engineer. Why are you here talking about the water treatment facility? Well, one of the things that in the long-term future, utilities have to be on the lookout for in Colorado is the long-term impacts on water availability from climate change and the changing seasonality of the availability of our water. And Colorado is thinking forward about this and has just promulgated regulations involving the direct potable reuse of wastewater and stages of treatment that allow utilities to directly treat and recover water and use it as maybe a long-term water supply, maybe a backup water supply to address water resiliency as climate change affects the water availability that we have in our region and in the Colorado River network overall. So this assessment looked at what would it take to treat per Colorado's adopted regulations to achieve direct potable reuse in Broomfield. And that would be, if you animate the slide, please, a facility located adjacent to the drinking water treatment facility, where you would take some of the water recovered from the effluent of the wastewater facility and use it as, and treat it through all of the treatment trains that are necessary per Colorado state standards. So this proposed an evaluation or a feasibility analysis of that and costs for that. Those costs are not included in this master plan. This master plan is about the wastewater recovery facility, but it's looking forward about water resiliency long-term. I think there's a fancy animation that zooms in on that. But I just want to highlight one thing about treating wastewater for direct human consumption is that there is an easy way to do it, but that's an extremely hard way to treat here in the mountains where we don't have an ocean to discharge brine streams to. So this is a non-reverse osmosis treatment train, which is allowed by the state regulations. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Ken, for the last couple slides. Next slide, please.
All right, so a couple things is, the wastewater treatment facility was last expanded was completed in 2009. So now that the current facility is, we're approaching 13 years old, 14 years old. And since then, city has grown quite a bit. I have to get my glasses out so I can see my notes. Happens, get older. Or use bigger font, but couple of things. Last year, the wastewater treatment facility treated about 2.3 billion gallons of wastewater. That's what we treat for the community. Since 2010, when the last expansion was well done, we've seen a growth in our collection system of 79%. We've seen a growth in the number of miles of sewer line equal to that 79%. We also seen an increase in our manholes, which is 75%, and overall a increase of about 132% of our storm system. So as we move forward with our next steps, these are all playing factors into our infrastructure needs and the growth of our community and why this expansion is needed and needed now. As it shows in 2020 and 2027, yeah, 2027, we'll be hitting there. We have a huge number of apartments coming online in the next several years, and that will push us close to our limits. Next slide. So from here, we'll solicit your feedback on questions. What you would like to see before we come back to you on October 10th is our plan to come back for official council approval, which we will need to move on to the next step, which is in December, we are planning to go to front of North Front Range Water Quality Planning Association and obtain their approval, which is required under the 208 planning under the Clean Water Act. And then it will be submitted to the health department, and then we will begin the process of each phase. Next slide. So that completes our presentation tonight, Ms. Hoffman. We're available for questions.
Well done. Council, we appreciate your time and attention to this. It is, we always say it's not sexy, but we've been living this for 2 years now. And to have this growth and acumen on our staff in order to bring us to this point, understaffed and under budget has been overwhelming and full of gratitude.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rutt, and to the team. That was very comprehensive, and thanks for breaking it down into easy to understand terms. We'll go to council questions next, starting with Council Member Marsh Holshan.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that presentation. It was very thorough, as the mayor just mentioned. I had a list of questions that I was checking off as you went with the presentation because you kept answering them. So I only actually have a couple left. One is kind of more general question. From what I've seen, many states have limited phosphates in detergents, and doesn't appear that Colorado has. And I obviously know that Broomfield doing it would not be effective alone. It would have to be a statewide thing. Have you heard any discussions of Colorado moving in that direction?
Generally, when it comes to phosphates and detergents, the approach that number of areas, especially in the Great Lakes region, has driven the manufacturers to change regardless of regulation. So the phosphate is coming from a variety of sources, but no longer are detergents the primary source of them.
Good, thank you. And then I just actually have one question about the project. Given that several neighborhoods in Ward 1 butt up against this facility, and the odor is a concern that I've heard from many residents, is the expansion of the project going to take that into consideration and improve on the current measures we have for odor control?
Yeah, that's correct. We are taking several different steps to minimize the odors. We're adding a wet scrubbing unit for odor control, which is a little different technology than we currently have. We currently use a biofilter, which is basically a biological process. We'll be also adding a second type of treatment, which is the wet scrubbers, which is a two-phase process.
And to address that, one of the first phase projects is this conversion of the open equalization basins on the south side of the facility. Those are open to atmosphere and potentially a source of odors. The new equalization basins that will be on the north side of the property will be covered, and the headspace of those units will go to the odor control treatment that Ken mentioned.
Great, thank you. One other question just popped up. You talked about the biogas. Are we going to be capturing 100% of that, or do we have an estimate of what?
Certainly never 100%, but the intent would be to beneficially reuse the vast majority. And just to give you a few examples, Boulder has a biogas beneficial reuse system they inject into the XL pipeline. Littleton has a system that they inject into the gas pipeline. Longmont uses it to fuel clean natural gas city garbage trucks. So that is something that your neighboring utilities have been doing.
So are we going to be using it 100%? The reuse will be 100% within this facility, or would it be potentially doing those type of things too?
Right. We looked at a variety of options. There's no locked in decision on the approach with that because it's a few years out, and the drivers for those individual alternatives are changing year over year based on incentives. Right now, the plan is centered around using the natural gas, the biogas on site to burn it, to generate electricity, to offset on-site electricity uses.
Okay, thank you. And just one comment, I wanted to thank you for including the slide on the producer price index and the costs that it has increased. Inflation is an important thing, and the subsequent discussions we're having tonight on the budget, our household budgets are, we see a lot of inflation, but that's the CPI, the consumer price index, which is based on a bucket of consumer goods. And when I looked at the CPI versus PPI recently, it seemed like in the last few years, it was nearly 3 times the CPI. So while our household budgets have gone up, our, city budgets have gone up, costs have gone up 3 times. So that was important information. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, team and staff. And you guys put this into great words for, I think, even high school students to learn. My old chemistry brain, I used to teach high school chemistry, and I really feel like you guys gave a really comprehensive, but yet also easy to understand and digestible way of presenting this information. I just have a few questions about, and if you don't know right now, that's fine too. We can answer this towards the end of this section of the meeting. How much are these unfunded mandates then adding to the cost? If we didn't have all these unfunded mandates, how much would this cost?
That was an important delineation of where the cost drivers are. I will say all of the pieces fit together, but we did basically with each of the costs an allocation of the different drivers that they are forced into action for. And so our best estimate was 39% of this is related to regulatory requirements. Those are primarily for nutrients, temperature, and the advanced PFAS and other trace organic compounds.
Okay, so then during that stakeholder moment where we realized that, or maybe other entities, what did that stakeholder input look like? What was the pushback? Do we know? Can you give some sort of bird's eye view as to what that looked like?
It's all happening along the way. So each individual regulation is adopted by the CDPH&E Water Quality Control Division and applied to each individual water body in the state. So there are efforts from utilities across the state to look at this moving forward. And I will say that regulation 31 nitrogen limit is probably the most significant individual limit for compliance, for costs of compliance.
Okay, thank
I
you.
wanted to also add that our staff is actively involved with the state in the various stakeholder groups. That effort is led up by Lisa Julian, our water quality and regulatory superintendent. And they participate in all the stakeholder groups and provide our input back to the health department.
Okay,
We also participate in wastewater utility council, which is the largest wastewater advocate for the different utilities that most of the wastewater facilities belong to. And they also provide, as well as North Front Range Water Quality Planning Association, they also provide input to help provide more sensible regulations sometimes.
okay, thank you.
Councilmember Hinkle, we'll have additional conversations on those regulation costs in the next conversation with the enterprise funds as well.
Yeah, I was thinking that we were, are there any regulatory concerns, or is this being addressed just with individual businesses producing this? Like if we have PFAS in our water, what does it look like for companies and or individuals to be more responsible with their waste? Is there any talk about that?
Currently, one of our permit requirements at the wastewater facility is that we have to do a PFAS community survey. And so for the last about 18 months, I believe it is, we've been sampling various pieces of the collection system, whether it was just solely domestic or commercial, industrial, or the airport. We've sampled all those locations and started to identify possible sources. And then we meet with those various businesses in that area and try to determine where the PFAS is coming from. And that's all part of our report that we have to submit to the health department here next summer.
Okay, yeah, I'd be interested in seeing, the sources of how they're getting into our water. It's much like our homeless issue, right? If we can prevent homelessness to keep people in their homes, I mean, that's probably a lot cheaper for sure. One last question. I love your temperature gauges, and it's interesting. We're trying to be environmental on one end, but it's costing us more, and it might even cost us additional greenhouse gas, emissions. So it's interesting to me to see this full circle. What does it look like for our emissions to cool the water down in the winter? And then could we do it more naturally if it is already cold in the air? What does that look like?
I think we would all love to use more natural treatment processes. I think one thing we didn't note is that the current plant site is 13 acres, which is not very big. To cool 12 MGD of wastewater, 10 degrees Fahrenheit, even in winter in the coldest, you would need somewhere around 50 acres of open water source to cool that. So other utilities are looking at this same thing because they have the permit limits coming down on them as well. And right now we are trying to do this in the maximum overall sustainable approach. So using land successfully, using energy successfully, but still meeting the permit limits.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all I have at this time.
Thank you. Councilmember Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. city and county manager, we've always heard that Sarah Grant's transportation manager gives the best presentations, but Ken, that was a solid number 2. The funds for this master plan, these come from the enterprise funds with the tap fees and the water usage fees. I'm curious, how much of this grand total do we have? About half, I think was what, 525 million roughly. How much of this grand total do we have budgeted already, and how will we secure these remaining funds in basically a short time of 10 to 12 years or so?
Going to hand that over to Brenda Ritchie to answer that question.
As she makes her way, That's strategically, we had this conversation first before we had the enterprise fund conversation so that we would be well versed with the wastewater component of it. As Brenda finds the slide, we'll do a deeper dive when we move into that enterprise fund. But again, that's the difference between, so in the enterprise funds, you have the operations and you have capital in each one of those funds. So enterprise overall, you can't fund anything from taxes in the enterprise fund. It's all user fee related. So the best way to think about it is it's not best practice either to be using or interchangeably those operation and capital funds within each one of those enterprise funds either. We've made that a best practice, which we say tongue in cheek, because it's not a practice that we are going to continue, which is the next conversation. Brenda, do you want to just do a high level of an answer for that for
Sure.
Councilmember Schaaf?
Appreciate it. And as you can see, it's a team effort. So Councilmember Schaaf, Brenda Ritchie, Chief Financial Officer. What we have budgeted within 2024 for the expansion is 5.8 million. And so you'll see that in the CIP long range, that can be seen as a line item within the sewer, specifically related to wastewater. That line item for 2024 is budgeted, and then the out years as well is programmed in as well.
I think that's enough to answer for now. So with the regulations and mandates, I mean, looking through there, some of these are, very necessary in terms of when we're talking about clean drinking water. But knowing that we can't just say no to these regulations and mandates, how much leniency do we have to extend those deadlines for those mandates and regulations? Is there any way that we can buy ourselves 6 months, 1 year, 2 years on those mandates and regulations?
The only way that right now that we can expand them is through that incentive program, which we're already taking advantage of. We are anticipating that we will get between 9 and 10 years of that extension, which begins in 2027 is when those regulations go into effect, and then we'll have 10 years. It'll be based also on when we get our next permit, because that's when that'll be incorporated into. And that's when they'll give us the compliance schedule. So the 2027, it's really tight. There's not a lot of ways to wiggle around that one, because that is set in state statute that we are required once we hit that 95 to either be in construction or stop building.
And I guess that kind of answers my next question, which is how much wiggle room do we have in this timeline? Could we start it in 6 months later? Could we start it a year later? Or is this really kind of one of those things where we are past the deadline in order to start this?
Can you let me know if you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, would you please?
Mr. Rutt is consistently thoughtful and tries to deliver a diplomatic answer. Frankly, the answer is no, Councilmember Schaaf. We have, and that'll be the part of the conversation part of the conversation that comes up next is because of the lack of care taken to future plan is why we are when we are. So we are in the black for 2023. We go into the red quickly in 2024, having taken into account this project, our Northern Water Tank project, and the regulations as a whole. So if it were just the regulation piece for the wiggle room, that would be one of the conversations, but it's really a totality of circumstances that have brought us to where we are right now. So it's too difficult to segregate out one of those components to correlate a 6 to a 9 month delay, because we don't have a 6 to 9 month delay on any of the other components that are included in that enterprise fund conversation.
Thanks for that. You know, what Councilmember Marsh-Holshan talked about was the cost increases that we've seen with capital projects. Is there a way to ensure that over these next 10 to 12 years that the costs don't rise unexpectedly? Is there a way that we can have some type of like guaranteed max price contract either for those design services or those construction services to ensure that we are able to manage those costs moving forward?
The simple and quick answer is no. And the reason for that is because particularly with this project, it is a mammoth, multi-phased project. So it's not unlike when CFO Richie walks us through having those funds encumbered. Councilmember Ward and I've talked about this quite a few times. When you go out for bid for those contracts, no one's going to bid on that contract unless you're guaranteeing that full phase of funding. So locking in anything long-term, because the developers and the folks that do that, all of that construction, particularly with the high technical nature of any one of these water projects, if their costs go up, they can't be tied into a contract that they signed with us. Because all of that language is based on their costs as well. So as much as we'd like to lock something in, we know that any delay, it's going to become more expensive, period.
And last question, do we anticipate to bond any of this project?
So I'm not being coy or diplomatic with my hesitation. Part of the conversation about the bonding is the power that council, the forethought to come up with a debt policy, to be able to say, through this lens, we will not bond anymore until we've paid off the outstanding bonds that we've had in place upwards of 20 years. And I'm not speaking about the First Bank Center because those are the borough bonds, but any of the COPs. We're just now getting ready to pay off the county bond that we've had in place for Health and Human Services, the detention center when we became a county, and the PD and courts. We'll pay that off in 2027. When we reduce the existing bond capacity, it opens up the availability to then pass through the community goal of number one, which was the financial. We won't take on more debt if we can't afford it. And can't afford it isn't a definition that's open for discussion. It's a set definition. So we want to ensure that when we went into the development of the 2024 budget, we'll have this conversation next. But we wanted to have a self-sustaining, which we've never had before, a self-sustaining enterprise fund, so that we wouldn't go from black to red so quickly. So we have been borrowing to make ends meet for about 15 years in that enterprise fund. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, but the operative word is borrowing, because we never paid it back, which is why we will go into the red next year. So an option for bonding. Yes. Is that the direction we want to go? No, it isn't. We want to be able to have a self-sustaining, long-term 50-year plan to do what it is this community needs.
And I guess it answers my question. In order to do this plan, we don't have to bond. I mean, that's along with our next conversation.
It is.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jesus, sorry.
Thank you. We'll move on to Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have two quick questions that came up during the presentation because I thought they were rather interesting. You mentioned that there is a portion of the plant that has been out of operation due to lack of maintenance, essentially. How long has that portion of the plant been out of commission?
Might be a longer answer than your question.
Yeah, that's
Thank you for your
fine.
question, Councilor Ward. We repaired, well, we have 3 digesters, digester 1, 2, and 3. We repaired digester number 2, and that has just been completed. Unfortunately, during the middle of that repair of digester 2, digester 3 failed. So it was, unfortunately, we had to put that digester repair off during the COVID times. It was supposed to be repaired in 2019. So it just recently got finished, I think in December of 22. And then digester 3 has failed. And at this point, since we are going to replace it, it's not feasible to spend the money to repair it at this point in time.
No, that makes sense. So a couple of years it's been
Yes.
offline. Thank you. And when was the last time the water treatment facility plant was actually, to kind of quote Manager Hoffman, touched from a just overall state of good repair?
Are you referring to the wastewater treatment facility?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the last expansion, when we did major updates and upgrades to the equipment, was completed in 2009. So that expansion occurred between about 2006 to 2009.
Thank you. And how long have those digesters been in place before they failed?
They are been installed around 1964. So they are 60 years old.
Is there a reason they were not updated sooner?
The
now?
plan was, because we went through in the last utility update, the plan was to do that during phase 3 of the expansion. Obviously, since we did phase 1 in 2000 to 2005, phase 2 was in 2006 to 2009. At that point in time, the capacity was adequate. So we didn't do phase 3, which was when they were going to do the digesters. So phase 3 was delayed until the capacity was needed. And unfortunately, between that time and this time, it failed. And then the master plan also had exceeded 10 years.
Okay, thank you. I asked those questions only because I find it somewhat unconscionable that we would allow parts of our wastewater treatment facility to deteriorate to the point where they actually fail and we have capacity constraints to a degree because one of them is offline. And I know those are previous decisions well before any of us came into the positions that we are currently sitting in, but I just was curious because I can't fathom letting that happen, but that's just me.
Councilmember, it's not unlike, and predecessors aside, whatever those decisions were or weren't, it's incumbent upon us to make that decision to have a self-sustaining fund now. Again, I think we're all in this room in agreement with that.
Yes, and I appreciate the current staff and this body for making that decision to have a sustainable financial future for not only the enterprise fund, but the general fund as we move into the next conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be quick because I know we have a lot more to discuss, but I wanted to follow up real quickly on Councilmember Schaaf's line of inquiry. Is it with the dollar amount on this one, is there anything left off the table, or is this was what everything was proposed or based on what we could afford? Catch my gist.
Thank you, Councilman Cohen. We, in our best of our ability, we tried to identify every asset, and that's what part of the condition assessment was all about, was to do a thorough evaluation of every treatment process to ensure that we capture as much as we could capture to include in the plan. And then through all of our, whether it was staff participation in the stakeholder groups or the consultants' participations, we tried to identify all of the upcoming regulations. And then obviously the capacity issue is just based on growth of our community.
So you don't anticipate a lot of the changes as we go. So it is a long time frame, and up to 2038. Obviously, costs will change. I assume other things will change. Is the cost estimate on the higher end, or is it on the conservative end, or is it our best guess?
We tried to include some, I guess, inflationary numbers in our cost projection to try to do the best that we could, knowing what we know today. Obviously, it's hard to project, 10, 12 years down the road what those costs are going to be.
And Councilmember Cohen, that's part of the shoring up and the sustainability of the enterprise fund is another best practice. You should have 180 days of operating funds for whatever that facility is at build out in your fund. We have 0 in each one of those funds. So not only contention funds, and anytime we have a best guess, we're always wrong. Anytime that we project, we're always wrong. Anytime that we've even gone 15 to 20% higher on these construction projects, doubling the CPI, wrong. So again, that's why it's incumbent not to rely just on the contingency funds, not just to rely on that savings, but also to have those additional funds from the 180 day of operations. So those 3 components are built into the enterprise funds that we'll talk about next.
So to your point, is this estimate of 524 million, 20% over, does it include that kind of allowance?
No, I don't want to go on record saying that we've pumped it up 20%. What we did was a really phenomenally thorough design and plan and implementation, and 224 million was the yield of each one of those components.
Okay, thank you. And on the term, I love the term energy recovery, just basically converting biogas to natural gas. Do we have an estimate of how much we anticipate saving the city by in the future doing that? I assume it pays for itself.
Yes, it's one of the rare things in a wastewater treatment world in which there actually is a payback. The payback is wholly based on what the incentive program is at the time that you achieve the implementation of it. Nevertheless, the other utilities I mentioned have received what they believe is payback for their facilities that they're installing. So that one, the benefit of that is financial in addition to being sustainable.
So the ones who are currently doing it are saving something off their bottom line.
That's correct.
Okay. And finally, since we just have experts in the room, I'm curious, you covered it, I think, briefly in terms of climate change and the temperature differences. I think Colorado by 2050 is supposed to be 4 degrees hotter in the summer. And does that calculate it into does that change what we're in designing this facility and taking into account the hotter summers and colder winters?
I think the biggest impact of that will be compliance with the temperature limits because the wastewater temperature will go up. Ken explained that the wastewater process is a biological process. And most biological processes actually occur more effectively at higher temperatures. So
It's the one good thing you're saying. Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Lim.
Yes, I appreciate Mr. Rutt referred to several times that what he said at ACES or what the discussion was. So I just wanted to say I appreciate that you all came to the ACES meeting to discuss the energy savings. The ACES meeting always has an expert of some kind in the room and in the technical fields that are presented. So I heard the discussion of the cooling towers and that we don't have the option to have the 50 acres necessary to do it without to cool the temperature without the cooling towers. As I looked at the facility map and you emphasized yourself the tightness of the fit. I guess, do we feel secure that everything is going to fit? I mean, obviously it would be a magnified impact if we thought about moving anything, but do we have confidence that everything's going to fit looking to the future?
Well, thank you, Councilmember Lim. Yes, we are very confident that what we have in our master plan will fit on a current site.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
I just have one kind of specific question here. So we're looking at all these new regulations and all these requirements. Is there like, does this cover the next 10 years or a couple of years? Could something else be added? Like, is there anything that hasn't been touched? Like, that just makes me nervous that we could have this plan going forward and then it might be.
There's two things certain in this world, right? Is death and regulations. They never stop. In my 35 years, they've only gotten more restrictive and have multiplied. To our current knowledge and in our participation in all the various stakeholder groups, and the state does have a 10-year roadmap, we've identified what they have identified in their 10-year roadmap.
Okay, so this feels like it could change, but we feel pretty confident that there's nothing major coming in the next.
Yeah, depending on what EPA wants to push, may influence the state. One example is PFAS. EPA is pushing that one really, really hard. And the state is having to adjust and add that to their 10-year roadmap. So there could be additional things, but to our knowledge at this point in time, based on what we know in the 10-year roadmap from the health department, we've identified the items they have shared publicly anyways.
Okay, Councilmember Anderson, just quick, just to give you, just as a point of reference, in 1 year from 22 to 23, we were testing alkaline monthly. State regs came out and we have to now test it daily. The cost of that was $837,000. It's not really a quiz. Have to look that up. We're going to talk about it in our next. Clearly, we've gone through these slides so many times. We now have them committed to memory. But again, that's the vacillation between their, we have a really good idea for the environment and everybody buys in, but and it's not even an unintended consequence from a health and safety perspective. But those costs are they're monumental. So do we anticipate additional regulations? Absolutely. Is there a way to anticipate those financially? No, because we won't know until the applications. To Councilmember Hinkle's, the PFOS, if the federal government makes a decision to implement fully on those PFOS, when 2 years ago, PFOS were in firefighters' foam and toilet paper. Now, PFOS are in, not now, like just now there's PFOS in them. 80% of our products have PFOS. From our clothing to our shoes, to the soles, to everything we touch, everything we use has PFAS. So again, there's no simple solution to winding our way through any one. I mean, that if PFAS is fully implemented, we won't be able to afford anything.
Okay.
I believe
And-
that cost was 650 just for the chemical,
Okay, thank you.
not counting operational, electricity, all that type of stuff.
So I guess there's like a second question to that, like, what about technological advances? Are we seeing, are we seeing? Would we anticipate seeing like 2 years down or 5 years down or down the road, we see something that would change our course, or does wastewater not develop as fast as some technologies and like?
Let the engineer, if you know.
Yeah, I think we do see this plan as a roadmap to adapt. We we do anticipate changing technologies. Oh, that's okay. I'm out already. There are changing technologies, there are advancing technologies, and there is an industrial financial driver to do wastewater treatment processes more efficiently, more energy efficiently, and to adapt ideas to treat different and newer constituents that have not been treated previously. Thank you. So yes, there is an anticipation that there will be advanced and changing technologies, which is one reason why it's advisable for the city to have phases of implementation. You don't try to do everything all at once, because if the limits aren't in effect yet, you may be choosing the wrong available technology at the time the limits do go into effect.
Okay, that's actually helpful on the first question then, because we've got the phase plan, but as we're moving into it, we would be able to relook at it. Okay.
That's the exact intent. This is a planning effort, and each phase would begin and move into a design effort to implement the best solution to achieve the intent of the plan.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. That's all my questions.
Oh, that's it. All right. Well, I think that's all for the council questions. I had one thought when you mentioned that the multifamily residential does conserve water. So that density conserves water, but does that density add cost to the wastewater treatment?
I would not say it does not add cost. What it does is the driver for the cost of the operations is the load more than it is the flow. The facility can convey the flow through it. Generally, there's a modest cost to pump the amount of flow, but it's negligible. The load drives the cost of aeration, which we talked about as the highest energy user. So the operating costs are driven by the load. So
And density has
Population.
a higher load.
Density brings more load in a given unit space. It does not bring a higher load per person.
Okay,
So load is generated by the number of people you have.
got it. All right. Well, thank you so much. And we appreciate this opportunity to ask questions. It's obviously a necessary project, and I'm glad we have the space and the resources to do it in a timely manner. So thank you all so much. Thank you all for what you do and for this wonderful planning. So we're set up for the future. Our next study session item is a discussion regarding the annual utility rate review and water and sewer fee recommendations. Council has a copy of this agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. And making her way up is CFO Richie. Mr. Rutt will stay close to Miss Ritchie for any additional questions,
Let me know if you need more water.
as will the team in the back. Miss Ritchie.
Thank you, Manager Hoffman, and good evening, Mayor, members of council and staff that have joined us here. Tonight, as we've already heard from Director Rutt, the demands of the daily operations as well as the constraints on the tight budgets really make it difficult to invest the time and resources necessary for that successful long-term planning, but that's why it's it's critical. So managing and planning for the future will help us reduce our overall costs and leaves our community in a much better place in terms of that legacy for sustainability and resiliency. And tonight we'll talk about that, how it relates to our utility infrastructure. Next slide, Kyle, thanks. So just from a high level perspective, this evening, we're going to review the enterprise funds, talk about key drivers that's impacting what's happening now and how does that look on our financial outlook. And then what staff recommends as we move forward to address those opportunities. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder for council and the community, we as Broomfield operate 3 enterprise or utility funds, and they are related to water, which is potable, wastewater, sewer, water reclamation, reuse. So deeper diving into that, as we can see here, water examples include showering, washing your dishes, brushing your teeth. Sewer is not just flushing your toilet, but anything that goes down the drain. And then water reclamation is the repurposing the use of that gray water material for purposes of irrigation. So that's why we see here that commercial homeowners association, golf courses, parks of that nature really are utilizing using reuse water reclamation. Next slide, please. So the utilities are operated as what we called enterprise funds, and that means they operate as their own separate business entity. That means the revenues that come in must support the expenditures that are going out. And they cannot by law be supported through taxes. So even though we are anticipating a larger proportion of our property tax to come in 2024, they cannot be used for our enterprise funds. They are strictly regulated to the revenues that are generated. So we further break those charges into, we look at 3 components. So one is the base fees, the user charges, and the license fees. We'll focus on the base and user charges. That's primarily going to be, your base fees are shared by all users of the system. So that's to ensure that if you're a customer of the system, you're equitably contributing to that ongoing preventative maintenance costs, the utilities, the energy required to just basically operate. So that base fee is what that all customers will have to pay. Your user charges are going to be related to your flow. So what comes, how much are you using? What does that consumption look like? That is going to be based on that demand. Whereas license fees are completely separate, and that's based, so taking a step back, base fees and user charges are for users of the existing system. License fees are there to support those new growth and development operations. So if you have a new apartment building coming in, for example, you need to be able to build the connection to provide those future tenants with supply of water and sewer. So in order to build that infrastructure, we have what we call license fees. Those license fees are intended specifically for that purpose of that new growth and development to be able to serve those future tenants. Then when those tenants come online, they will move towards the base fee and the usage charges because they'll actually be consuming whether it's water or sewer. Next slide, please. So we're just going to jump right into what are we proposing and work our way back. So if you recall back in 2012, was the last rate study. In 2022, staff came forward with a proposal, worked with an independent consultant to relook at the rate study, do an analysis. What is our structure? What's our model? And what do we anticipate? Because again, we have to generate enough revenues to support those expenditures and what we have planned. Therefore, we took everything that we had in our CIP in 2022 that we had planned related to water, sewer, and reuse, plugged it into the model, and had developed a 5-year outlook. That has changed. There's a lot of circumstances that we'll get to in upcoming slides, but we wanted to be able to say, what is that impact on a residential customer, both from a single family use as well as a multifamily, so an apartment dwelling individual. So we focused on 2023 for both of those bills is what's the current state and what are we proposing in order to meet those demands of 2024. 25 through 28 is strictly a projection of what we anticipate those bills to be going forward based on, again, what we have planned in the budget, as well as you heard earlier this evening, Director Rutt kind of talk about the wastewater treatment expansion. What do we need? What are those ongoing regulations related to mandates? They all come into play, and we need to be able to support that through these fees. So this is what we have, and we'll get into a deeper dive, but just wanted to highlight the anticipated bills that we're looking at in the long term. And again, it was a great question that just came up earlier of those projections. What happens if, costs come in differently? We evaluate this. The model is structured in a way that we take a look at it on an annual basis as part of our budget process. So working in conjunction with not only finance and public works, but all of the departments, including community development, for example. What do we anticipate to come online? So it's really taking a culmination of all the various departments to be able to say, here's our projections, here's what we anticipate for the coming year. What are other various factors? So we heard last week from our economist and director of economic vitality, Mr. Romine, highlighting the economic influences that are happening. So we also have to take those into account as we look at our projections and develop that model and to develop our forecast. And again, just want to highlight, it's just a forecast because with the best laid plans, they never come to fruition. So if we jump to the next slide, we'll kind of see, we'll go into our current state. Next slide, Kyle. And what are the key challenges? And this was touched upon. So these next several slides are really to highlight what's happening in 2023. One of the biggest impacts that we saw for 2023 regarding our revenue changes was related to weather and conservation. We want to promote conservation efforts, but again, with more conservation, increased conservation efforts, you have less usage, less revenue. Same thing on when it comes to weather. So we had the first couple of months, and this graph depicts where we were in 2023, and it's right under the blue line, which is 2019, which again had pretty wet or high precipitation in your April through June months. So therefore, again, increased precipitation. We would anticipate those users that would water their lawns, for example, not be able to do so as much or with the frequency they would if it was drier or we had drought conditions. So that is one of the biggest factors that we saw in adjusting our revenues for 2023. In our next slide, we've discussed development. So we've seen with the economic influences of higher interest rates, for example. So in terms of building, financing, it doesn't make sense for a developer to continue if the interest rates are high. For them, they're in the business of making a profit. As a city and county, we're not. We as running an enterprise system are needing to generate that enough revenue to cover those expenses. So we've looked at specific areas in terms of baseline area in the North Park area. There was Wadsworth Apartments recently came forward. They had projected some units in and had requested permits in early 2023. They have now determined that due to financing, they can no longer move forward. So it's things of that nature that we're starting to see regarding development that are being impacted. So if that development slows, when we anticipate the development to come online and we project in our revenues to see those tap equivalents, those sewer lines, for example, that's going to have an impact. The other component, which we've touched pretty at length with earlier, was the regulatory mandates that we're seeing. So we've seen with our wastewater treatment, whether that's in the frequency of testing, whether it's the chemicals that we need to use, we're seeing an increase related to those regulatory mandates, whether it's the state or federal level. And then the other component is related to that the rate increases. And if Kyle, we can go to the next slide. This highlights that 2012 study that was done and the recommendations that were made. And you can see they're in conflict. So there were proposed rate increases with that study throughout the years, and the actual corresponding rate increases differ. Regardless, we're at a point where we recognize we're not even keeping up with basic inflationary costs. So we just wanted to highlight that there are some changes that need to be done, and that was done through our new model that was proposed last year, is to really make sure at a bare minimum, we're addressing the basic cost of inflation in our projections is in terms of the revenue. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have other factors that are impacting both our water and sewer planning is related to our contractual obligations. So these are elements, bless you, that we have regardless of the fact that, we need to be able to provide safe, clean water, reliable sources in that infrastructure. In order to do so, we are beholden to our contractual obligations. So Denver Water, for example, has increased their water shares in 2024. Therefore, we have to absorb that cost and we're required to pay those costs. Northern Water, those assessment fees, which are not related to the Chimney Hollow or the Windy Gap construction, but our annual obligation has also increased. We've also seen that cost recovery program increase for them as well. So again, these are required aspects, contractual obligations that in order for us to continue to deliver on those utilities, we need to be able to provide. And the other note is really the inflationary and supply chain constraints the director mentioned. In fact, if we go to our next slide, it's the same exact slide that you just saw. It's just highlighting the fact that in the last 3 years, we have seen a significant increase related to that producer price index related to the inflation. So touching back on those rates that were done in 2012 versus now, at that time and during that period, we have not seen the convergence that we have in the last several years of a culmination of various elements. We might have experienced some aspects of slow development, some aspects of inflation, some aspects of supply chain issues. But really, it's within the last couple of years and specifically last year and this year that we're seeing the convergence of all of that culminate as to why the expenditures are a lot greater than what we had anticipated for. Next slide, please. What does that mean? So basically looking at just our water scenario, by doing nothing, we will not be able to sustain the system. So therefore, I mean, as you can see, highlighted by all of the red, just looking at 2024 alone, we do not have, if we stay on this current path of what we have proposed last year, based on what we had anticipated on those planned expenditures, we would be at a shortfall and a deficit in 2024. And what that does is compound year over year. We see the same thing. If we go to the next slide, in terms of the sewer fund. One thing you might want to, I'd like to call out here is the fact that we have a capital balance and an operating balance, and Manager Hoffman earlier kind of mentioned about the borrowing from either. Now you might say, hey, we have a fund balance, a positive fund balance. We're in the black. Why can't we borrow from one from the other? While we can do that, the key is the fact that one, we need to plan and program in the repayment of that, because it's not best practice, because it's not, as mentioned, we're not sustaining that area. An aspect of capital should be funding, generating the revenue to fund those capital expenditures, and the operating should be able to sustain on its own. So what this does is just highlighting again what the outlook is for it staying on the current path. Next slide, please. And so moving on to taking all of that, what does that mean for the customer? What does that mean for our financial outlook in terms of the proposals? On our next slide, we see that staff is recommending that really in order to meet the planned demands of what we have to meet our debt obligations, to meet our capital improvements, our operating and maintenance costs, there needs to be an increase on both the revenue and rate structure side for all of the utilities related to water and sewer. I just want to call out that it's important to note that revenues are different, very different from rates. So the revenues, again, are needed to generate and cover those expenses. The rates are what generate those revenues and are what's charged to the customer. So they're two very different things. They're related but different. So someone might be saying, hey, I'm seeing a 40% increase, and that's not your rate. That's how much revenue is maybe we're calculating to need versus a 6% increase in the actual rate. And so that's going to translate, I think, in the next couple of slides. Thanks, Kyle. If we do go to what we're proposing, we're looking, and I realize I should have put this after the next couple of slides, but what we're looking at is really balancing for what, again, we have projected and programmed in for the next couple of years. But again, we will always take it on an annual basis, determine what are those influences that are coming from outside factors, as well as things that have shifted, whether it's technology, as Councilmember Anderson pointed out, that is improving. We would want to be able to take that into consideration. How does that impact what revenues that are needed to generate to support the funds? So this is kind of just our outlook. If we were to go to our next slide, Kyle. Thank you. And this is specifically single family homes. What we're looking at is a roughly a $12 increase for your average user for a total bill in terms of water and sewer. One of the things that we did change from last year to this year. So if you recall, last year was the first year that Broomfield went to a tiered rate system. We've done the analysis, we've looked at it and determined, because one of the questions that came up is why is the ranges so high? So if you recall, the previous range, the current ranges, excuse me, are 0 to 10,000 gallons, 10 to 20, and anything over 20. There was a wide range because at the time we didn't have enough data to be able to pull together and see what the usage was to come back with the recommendation. Staff has done the analysis and gone through the work and have determined that these ranges are where the average customer is. So if we take just the baseline of the 0 to 5,000 gallons, we anticipate that all customers of the system for water will be using that basis. So that's, again, you're washing your dishes, you're brushing your teeth, you're showering. That's component of that 5,000. That next tier of 5 to 9 is that discretionary. So summertime, I'm going to irrigate my lawn 2 times, 3 times a day in the evenings, whatever the case may be. I'm going to choose to wash my car. That is usually when we see in those peak demand areas is roughly that 9,000. Therefore, we thought that it would be equitable to be able to say for those discretionary uses, this would still not impede or be an undue burden on that customer. And so then anything over 9,000 is where that next shift occurs. So staff's recommending a basic flat rate increase, again, to cover those basic maintenance operational costs. And then based on usage, wanted to also include that. And then you'll see with our sewer side, we also have some proposed rate increases related to the usage as well as our compliance fee. So that what the compliance fee covers is unfunded mandates. But as we're seeing very quickly that there's quite more than we can handle. So we thought this was a reasonable amount given what we're seeing to help with any future unfunded mandates that might occur to first be able to set up, if you will, a reserve account to be able to address those without having to automatically first go to raising rates. So that's how the impact is on a single family user. And if we move forward to the next slide, please. This is what a multifamily, so in an apartment complex, what you're going to see, the average increase is roughly $8 is what we're anticipating. And keep in mind, with all of these slides, with the previous one and the next one we'll see for commercial, this is all going to depend on where the size of the meter, how much usage they are using, where they're located, single family, multifamily. So this is, again, we've taken all of the data and aggregated it towards an average of what the average user that we're seeing. So for a multifamily unit, we can expect a customer of that system to be roughly $8. Next slide, please. And then our final slide related to the proposed customer impact is those commercial aspects. And so we have, again, notating that the 1 inch, 2 inch, that's specifically related to the size of the pipe of line for folks. And that's going to vary depending on the type of industry. So we see here, you can see there's variances for a church versus industrial irrigation and some examples there. The irrigation has gone down that we've seen. And again, that's going to be your users. That's based on the cost of service for that specific utility. And so those adjustments were made based on that. So again, you'll see where adjustments can go up or down. Next slide, please. And so while we know the question always comes up of how do we compare to everybody else, we wanted to be able to take a look at that in our next slide, but I want to be able to caveat and say that it's important to recognize that it's never a one-to-one, right? We don't know what goes into another community's infrastructure, the age of their infrastructure, maybe the size of the lots that they're servicing. How far developed are they? Because you could have a community that's well beyond and fully developed versus an infant community that's in its planning stages and starting to develop. So depending where they are in the process, that has a lot to do with the factors in terms of their pricing in their system. The other component is they might have water rights. We don't, right? And so there could be development impact fee, other areas that that they have used to fund their utilities we don't always have a 1-for-1. So I just want to make sure to call that out, that it's really important, while we all like to look and see, hey, how do we compare to everybody else? It's important to recognize that it's not an apples to apples comparison. That all being said, as Director Rutt indicated, we all have to be in compliance with those, we choose to be in compliance with those regulatory mandates that are forthcoming. So that will be coming down across to all of the communities. How we choose to implement it, how we choose to phase it is a factor, a variable factor. The other component is, that also determines how much outside available funding. Broomfield being a higher affluent community might not be subject to award for a lot of the grants, for example, that might go to your more socioeconomic disadvantaged communities to be able to help support that infrastructure. The other component is that phasing, that level, the population. Based on our population, we might have different regulatory standards than another community. So again, just aspects to keep in mind when we compare. And if we move to the next slide, we'll still see that even where Broomfield currently is, and this is water and sewer combined, and where we're proposing to be for 2024 is still lower among all of our neighboring communities in terms of its total bill. And so again, it's a slide that we want to be able to highlight to say, because the question does get asked, how does Broomfield compare? But making sure that we're still not near where the other communities are. And again, it'll depend on what factors go into play there. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, we do have reuse as another utility. At this time, staff is not proposing any changes related to reuse. The Public Works team, as well as finance and others, will be taking a look at our reuse utility, as well as, and I'll talk about our stormwater utility as well, developing that. So in 2024, so staff will do the evaluation and analysis and come back to council with any recommendations to changes at that time. But currently for 2024, not proposing any changes related to reuse. Next slide, please. And so mentioned that we have 3 components of how we fund our enterprise system, and the last being the license fee, again, related to development. If we go to the next slide, again, this is just a high level overview, just summing it up. License fees support new growth and development, and that will eventually flow through the utility systems for the end user of the system that will be then charged, the base charge and the user charge for consumption. Next slide. And at this time, the only recommendation that staff is making related to the license fee is an increase for the water licenses of approximately $1,400. Again, we're seeing that need based on the mandates that are coming through for that infrastructure. And so at this time, we're only proposing that water license fee. Next slide, please. And then kind of wrapping up other considerations for 2024, as I mentioned, staff's going to be looking at developing a stormwater utility. Last year, when we did the initial look, it wasn't time, but we do believe that it's time to start looking at that. The other reason is there's a lot of existing capital projects, for example, that we could be leveraging through getting additional funds through Mile High District funding, for example. So by having, we're not eligible currently because we do not have a stormwater utility. So that would open up some possibilities to help fund some of the existing projects that we have and alleviate some of that burden. The other component is to improve our utility billing statements and our system. So I know it was asked last year, Councilmember Schaaf, on the budget billing, whether we can do that on a monthly basis and be able to do that similar to an Excel or electric or gas. Unfortunately, our system, as antiquated as is, we are working as we source the new financial solution. We will be making that a requirement to look at part of the utility component to be able to include that. So we are, again, continuously looking at ways to improve. We have incorporated some look backs in the utility billing statements. We haven't gotten as far as we'd like based on the limitations of the system, but it is something that staff is working towards. And the other component that is top of mind is always the education around conservation, and wanted to highlight that we do have programs with our partners with the CSU Extension as well as here in Broomfield, and our team with Water Resources internally does a phenomenal job working with Resource Central to be able to provide those water audits and garden in a box, for example. So those are on a first come, first served basis for the community, but being able to highlight, and we did in the 2024 budget are proposing an increase to that line item to be able to help fund that and support that. Next slide, please. So some just key takeaways is that really in order to be able to deliver the clean, safe, reliable utilities and, not have to worry about your water being clean, drinking water, being able to flush your toilet and it doesn't back up. That's all done by the work, all of our staff, and really takes a concerted effort, but it comes at a cost. And so in order to make sure we don't jeopardize that cost and to continue to provide that is to invest in the infrastructure. So really being able to, it's not cheap to provide, as Ken mentioned, that over 4 billion gallons of water and distribute 2 billion gallons of that, as well as treating that 2.3 billion gallons of wastewater. It takes a lot. So in order to do that, we need to be able to, and that's why staff is recommending the increases and the path forward in the structure and methodology that we've done. Next slide. So just kind of wrapping it up, for additional support, we know and recognize that it could be challenging for some of our community members related to their bills. There is support. Our utility billing team is phenomenal in their response to work with customers on setting up payment plans. While we might not have a monthly budget system, billing system, we do have the ability through our staff to be able to work with customers, and we have done that to be able to work on a billing plan and a payment option. So there's just some different options to either go online, call, or email. And then again, to learn more about our conservation efforts and the water resources, to go to broomfield.org /save water as an opportunity. And then I think last slide, Kyle. Thank you. Next steps, looking ahead. So tonight we'll just kind of engage in the discussion, get some direction on what we're looking at, and staff is looking to propose next month along with the budget, first and second reading of an ordinance change that would adopt a 5-year structure. And again, keep in mind, just like we did last year, we will continue on an annual basis to continue to look at it and adjust as necessary, and then have those rates effective beginning January 1st, which would show on the February billing statement. And that concludes staff's presentation.
Mayor, if I may quickly, before we go to council conversations, Kyle, could you go back to slide 9, please? So much like everything that we have been doing for the last 4 years, it has been a yeoman's effort to identify where we are, peel back the layers of the onion, and have a structural modification from a staff perspective as well as from an output perspective. So we now implement a whole host of models. Ms. Ritchie spoke about the complexity of each one of these models. It's not just one model. It's a comprehensive overview that takes a multidisciplinary team in order to come up with what these recommendations look like. One of the reasons that staffs and councils don't do this work is reflected on this slide. And we can't underscore enough what these decisions have done to the Public Works team from a staffing perspective, has and continues to put folks in harm's way as they continue to bear the brunt of an unupdated infrastructure system. And that goes across each one of these enterprise funds. So included in those recommended increases is also to ensure that our staff has adequate folks to do the technical job. Our wastewater technicians have been doing, I don't want to say more with less. They've just been doing less and less and less and maintaining that level of service at the cost of making everybody feel much better by not doing these increases. So the compound nature is, it's excruciating. So when you look at over a period of time where we should have increased and you continue to see those zeros, particularly on the sewer fund, both of those funds, but again, that one in particular with the wastewater, when you compound, it's not, you don't just add, right? So you don't take 13% one year and then it's 26 next year. It's significantly higher than that each one of these years. In addition to all those complexities that Ms. Ritchie mentioned about the inflation rates, the construction rates, and all of those other PFAS and regulatory impacts that we have. So when staff put through all of these outputs in our new model, again, the first time that Broomfield's had a model was last year. I can tell you there were 16 of us sitting around this table with our jaws dropped. So we don't make this recommendation lightly. We know how difficult it is. We know where the community is with regards to the state assessment rates. This has been a really professionally and personally very difficult decision to move forward with this. And we know that it is for you all as well. So as Ms. Ritchie said at the beginning, we have to look at this as an independent business. And if we looked at this utility as an independent business, all of leadership would be fired. So from a fiduciary duty perspective, as difficult as it is, the outputs are not something that we would, that we were pleased about. I mean, 80% of us live in this community. I live a block from the wastewater treatment facility. So yeah, am I super excited about not having it? Yes, I am. But again, we just, again, just a note of personal privilege. It's difficult for us to bring this. But it's something that it needs to be done. And we don't want any of our names attached to the 2023 rate study and having another zero by it.
Thank you, Manager Hoffman. And thank you so much, Ms. Ritchie. And again, to the team, we are going to take our 10-minute recess before going to council questions. So it is 8:13. We'll be back at 8:23. Thank you. And we just finished item 2. So we're going to move to council questions and comments. Who would like to go first? Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have one quick comment that I want to make to clarify one of the slides, which was the proposed rate increase estimate bill for the single family. And that's based solely on that proposed bill was based off of 9,000 gallon usage for that 4-month high to summer, correct?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Ward. That is correct. So that 9,000 usage was based on that peak demand period. If you, and I misspoke earlier, I realized it's 0 to 5,000. It was and 5 to 20 and then 20 and over our current tiers, not the 10. But that is based on the current demand, peak demand.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that those that have less usage will see a lesser bill than what was proposed on this slide, but a higher bill if they use more than 9,000.
That is correct.
And then a question for staff is how much of the system is over 20 years old, 40 years old, and 60 years old?
Mr. Rhett will correct me if I'm wrong, but 25% is over 40. Yes. Yes, I got the head affirming. Yes. Yes.
How much of it is over 20 years old?
Ken's going to look at that really quickly. And I think Councilmember Ward, if I'm picking up what you're putting down, which is probably the hippest thing I'm going to say all night long. Thank you to my children. It's when you ask about the life of some of these pieces of infrastructure, they can be anywhere from 50 to 80. But it's if you take care of them, it's like anything else. If you want it to last, as long as it possibly can last, you have to provide nurturing and care on it. The picture, the photo that we've used in both of the previous presentations where the transformer, thousands of pounds, was hanging over the heads of our dedicated staff live, right? Because they can't shut down a transformer. So Excel had to, with their lift, keep that transformer in the air during a 18-hour period for them to go and dig up a piece of pipe that had been over time smashed. So of course, those joints can't hold any longer. It was on Industrial Lane. So that's just but one example. We had another main break 2 days after this. So, and again, from a staffing perspective, we can't even rotate that staff. I mean, some of our folks were up for 36 hours going from one break to another break. That impacted our seniors because it was by Gate and Green. So again, it's not just the life and the age of the pipes. It's the maintenance, and it's the consistent maintenance. I think Mr. Rutt went through it really quickly. So I beg your indulgence, but and there wasn't a slide attached to it, Ken, but when you talk about the increased number of hydrants, the increased number just in the last 9 years, recount those 3 pieces just real quickly, would you? It gets to Councilmember Ward's question, not only about the age of the infrastructure, but the pressures put on with all of what the new growth has brought to us.
Thank you for the question, Councilman Ward. Just for example, on the sewer side, we have since 2010, we've had about 79% growth in the infrastructure without adding a lot of staff, equipment, resources. So we've had to absorb that because every time a new development comes on, we have to absorb that into our operations. So, so that has increased our costs on the sewer side. The same thing on the water side. we have about 74% increase in our water system. And to answer the question, there's about 41% of it. It's about just under 20 years.
All right, thank you. Yes, Manager Hoffman, you did kind of pick up what I was putting down, but I think that phrase stopped being popular after the 90s.
Dan,
Well,
I don't, you know, I still tell staff
in the
to,
90s.
I still ask staff to use me as a tool, which apparently that's not cool anymore either. So. So I'm 0 for 2. There you go.
Yes, thank you. And you actually did read my mind as it came to that picture. I did want it brought back up. Because how long were some of those businesses in that area without water? I think
30, 36 hours, Mr. Rep.
And when I first saw that picture, to be honest, I thought it was a cave.
I'm sure that our fellas that were down there felt exactly the same way.
So I just wanted to point that out. And all the questions point out that we have not historically done a good job with doing a consistent maintenance of our water sewer infrastructure. And that does have financial implications, not only for us, but also for our community, our businesses. I mean, if you have a business offline, or not necessarily offline, but without water for 3 days, but not day and a half, sorry. That's hard for
It's
them.
impactful.
It's very
Absolutely.
impactful. And so I just wanted to point that out. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Shaft.
Thank you, Mayor. Since most of my questions, or all of my questions, were asked during the previous item, I just want to thank you for the thoughtful analysis, the concise presentation. I'm also assuming, Mr. Rutt, that many of the people in the back room, especially, and probably some closer, all work in the water and sewer system. So, I thank you all for your work on this. This is very important to the residents of Ward 3, but I think all the residents and businesses of Broomfield. So thank you for your work on this. I do support staff's recommendation. I look forward to, a system that's working well, that doesn't cause trauma in the middle of the night. Hopefully we can get to a place where we have a sound system moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Marshall.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had a couple questions and a few comments. I noticed that the multifamilies don't have a tiered structure. Why is that? And what's the average use for a multifamily resident?
The question, Councilmember Marshall-Holston, the reason for the tiered, so in our single family home, you are going to have different consumption for example, watering your lawn and washing your car. You don't have that at your at an apartment complex. That's done. The irrigation would be done through the apartment complex. So therefore, it would be through that potentially that reuse component that would be then charged to those residents. But therefore, there's no tier. And I believe probably in small print, average is slide 18. And it looks like it is 3,200, approximately 3,250 gallons per month.
Okay, thank you. And then one question that I know the answer to, but anybody watching, what was the usage rate for residential water usage prior to 2023? The flat rate we used to charge.
I'm sorry, is it for per gallon?
Yeah, per thousand gallon, wasn't it? It was 331, right?
I'd have to go back and I should know that off the top of
Okay,
my head. I apologize.
I guess my point is just pointing out that even with this increase, the under 5,000 gallons, those residents using under 5,000 gallons are still seeing a decrease in their water usage rate, even with the proposed increases. The 5 to 10, or what is it, 5 to 9 is seeing a slight increase. It's really the over 9 that's where they're seeing the extra. So I just wanted to point that out for everyone. And then can you, on the licensing fee, do we have an estimate of how much the licensing fee should be if it was going to pay for the capital we need, if it was going to pay for itself.
So we always appreciate those questions. We estimated by our model that if it was to, so again, this gets our funds self-sustaining and our staff where it needs to be, but it doesn't pay its own way. So we've had this conversation before about development paying its own way. Development has never paid its own way. Development will not ever pay its own way long-term. Development pays its own way for that snapshot in time. And so it's the gap on the maintenance. We estimated that this was another one of those jaw dropping on the yield piece, that it would go up 1,000 times.
To pay for it would 1,000 times the 14,000 that we're
Correct.
proposing. Okay, that's what I thought. So, thank you. And then just a couple comments. One on the previous item that kind of it ties to this. We talked a lot about unfunded mandates and the regulations for safe water and drinking. And you know what? I support the mandates. I think they're essential science-based to ensure clean drinking water and no harmful effects downstream. The unfunded part, I don't support. I just want to point out for the residents of Broomfield that City and County of Broomfield is members of multiple state and federal lobbying organizations like the National League of Cities or National Association of Counties. And there's been discussion in the past of council's travel budgets. And those trips are for us to participate in those lobbying efforts to try and address the unfunded part of those mandates and try and get our federal and state partners to throw in the money that they should be to pay for some of this stuff. And then on this topic, I support these increases. This is probably one of the harder decisions you can ever make being up here because it is directly impacting people's lives and their pocketbooks. And we have to take that into consideration. But frankly, to be less than diplomatic, we have to make the hard choices today because in the past decade, it wasn't. You look at the sewer rate slide and they proposed, what was proposed versus what was enacted was 63% less than what should have been to make us financially sustainable. And we have to make the hard decisions now in order to make up for that and keep us sustainable in the future. So that's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Lim.
Yes, I guess I have a philosophical question related to the license fees. So you said, you looked at the model and you said, well, the license fees would have to be 1,000 times. It's great to have development pay for that itself. How did you come to a point at which you said, okay, we can raise it this much, but not any further? From a resident perspective, I want to make sure that new development anticipates in some way its future maintenance cost in the licensing fee. So I'd like a little more insight into how you say, well, I can raise it this much for the developer, but I can't raise it more.
It's a secret sauce. If we all had, again, the matrix to be able to say, we have to be mindful. So when we're talking about a totality of circumstances and looking at it comprehensively, we don't have the luxury to be able to say, let's charge a lot over here to make up over here. Because what'll happen is then we'll cut development off altogether. And then that gets back to our community goal of fiscal sustainability and resiliency to be able to say, we have to have a balance between residential and commercial. Part of our KPIs is to rebalance that. What has made Broomfield historically so strong is that we've always had that fundamental commercial base, which has allowed us the freedom and service level, quite frankly, that we have now. So if we come out on those tap fees, and we're not talking just resident development, right? It would be tap fees across the board. So again, it's that litmus test between how much and policy implications matter on costs. They just do. And part of that policy recommendation from our perspective is seeing what the surrounding area from tap fees, again, because of the competitive nature of commercial development. If we get too far out of line, all of the other accoutrements that Broomfield brings for our commercial base will seem less appealing. So again, Councilmember Lim, we appreciate the question. We too struggle with that. But it's that's the comprehensive nature of having a model. That's why it's so key for us to be able to have that so that we can then, when we see what the yield is, you can either modify it back. But we have to look at all of those elements. We have to look at continuously. It's the same conversation we've had on the long range financial plan. Nobody balances their checkbook every 5 years. Nobody should be looking at their rates every 5 years. And they certainly shouldn't be making recommendations based on capacity and the smoothing effect, right? Again, from an enterprise capacity, it all gets back to that balance that we have to be able to maintain that commercial and residential balance from a totality of circumstances. So again, we'll continue to review that. We'll continue to review where we are in that quotient. And that again, will in fact, whether it's an artificial slowing of development. But you can't segregate residential development from commercial development on those tap fees. We need to be really, really mindful of that.
Thank you very much for that explanation. Recognizing that the average resident will find a $12 monthly average increase for water and sewer, there will be at least some residents who will find that a cost burden. And we did put into effect a senior property tax refund, and it's budgeted for next year. So did we have any discussions? This is different funds. I know that this is the enterprise fund. This is not the general budget. We're talking about with the property tax refund. Did we have any thoughts about implementing a similar, targeted refund program for these increases?
I will look to City Manager Hoffman to assist me on this, but I can start to answer the question, Councilmember Lim. Yes, staff did look at that. One of the variables that goes into is how to spread that cost, because somebody within the system, another user would have to help subsidize, but again, because the money has to stay within the system and we can't use outside funding to support it. Whereas in general operational governmental funds, you have that flexibility and the agility to be able to say, I can take programmatic dollars to help support these. Given that the enterprise fund is restricted on taking outside funding, it makes it more difficult. So developing, it would take a thoughtful structure that we would have to look at and evaluate. But at this time, we did not find it feasible or a mechanism to adequately address it, that some users of the system would be subsidizing those that could not afford to pay. That is why Broomfield, the utility billing division, continues to work with those individuals that cannot. And we look to, the state program has ended for their funding, but we will continue to look at what other avenues there are for additional funding to help those customers. We did receive just actually this week a check from the state based on those COVID funds. They did allocate a certain amount of money. We're actually working with the state to determine how we can distribute those funds for that specific use at this time, whether it has to go to those same users or if it can be generated based on need.
That's fine. Thank you. I guess I would appreciate, when we get it, you're going to do an annual modeling on this, obviously. We're going to hear the results of that annual modeling. We're going, and possibly how we're doing with the revenue based on the rate increase. Certainly, I think part of that I would like to hear in the future would be, how many, did we see an increase in those who had to reach out for the payment plan? That I think that would be, useful information. I would think for myself, maybe the rest of council to hear, just to see the impact of that.
If I may, just to follow up on that, we have been monitoring that. Anytime we do adjust the rates, we do have the staff work to kind of analyze those metrics. And we have not seen a large increase outside of what we typically see. And those users, it's really a small percentage of our overall customer base. I will say that that require assistance or require a payment plan related to that. So that is actually a small percentage of our customer base, and we will continue to monitor that as we move forward. And we're happy to report back.
Great. That's good to know. It's not needed too much so far, but yes, thank you for the continuing information. Those are my questions. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
Okay, I have a couple, well, my first question is kind of related to it's just, we have a significant increase, not just the first year, but every year going on, which I think that's the concern I see. I understand that. And that's, I mean, it's necessary, and I see the cost, and I understand why we're doing it. But so this goes back into the education piece and the need to kind of help educate the public that this is a very, in the original water study last year, it didn't seem that great of an increase, but now residents are going to feel it as the years go by. So we focus on education and helping people to cut back on water. But if that's successful, and I just want to emphasize that that's so critical. If that's successful, and with units coming on slower, and also if the public responds, our water use goes down. And then does that slow the dates that we trigger? If we seriously reduce the water consumption, would that have an impact on those phases?
So that's a great point, Councilmember Lim, and one that I was going to jump in on, but I didn't want to interrupt Brenda, and I just didn't wrap around to it. So the system, whether regardless of how much water's in it, has to be paid for, right? So the system costs is the system cost. So that's another one of those. You squeeze a balloon, it's going to come out somewhere. So when you conserve water, because it's the right thing to do, it's not unlike when we focus on conservation and then we have a really wet spring. It still costs us the same to move that water from point A to point B, and we have less revenue in order to do it because we've had all of that rain and people are cutting back on their water. So again, it's not unlike Councilmember Lim's question about how each one of those elements impacts it. The greatest impact to what the recommended self-sufficiency for that enterprise fund is really going to be the regulatory piece, because we know that we have to expand the wastewater treatment facility. We know that we're moving forward on the northern tanks next week. Those two CIP projects alone are really driving what those next 5 years are to be sustainable. And 39% is really those regulatory costs. So if the feds and or state come out and say, we don't need to be that stringent, or we're going to gradually phase in what those requirements and accoutrements are, that will impact our bottom line as well.
So I think my question was more about, will we slow because we're using less water, would we slow any of those trigger dates? I mean, so are each of those phases, are they triggered by the overall wastewater that's flowing to the system, or is it triggered by these regulatory mandates that they have to be met by certain dates? So is there anything that by us using less water would slow any of those upcoming dates?
No, basically, because you got to look at the system as a whole. Everything has to be built to that maximum monthly usage, whether water or wastewater, because you have to supply the maximum demand. So even on water conservation, may not use it all that capacity, but you have to be able to build it to that max day. And from a wastewater perspective, those regulation drivers will drive us. Capacity is going to be used up around 2027 with our organic. If you just look at all the apartments being built and all those other things that are coming in, we will use up our organic capacity. So it is a little bit on growth, but it is also contributed to regulatory.
Okay, and then I guess one thing I'm not understanding is why we're not raising the sewer license fee. We're having drastic increases in the ongoing monthly charges, but yet the sewer license fee remains unchanged. And is that just because none of these new costs are related to the new infrastructure? Is this all regulatory? Is that why we're not adjusting sewer license fees?
In terms of the sewer license fees, that's phased approach. So you'll see that come in. We have the necessary funds related to license fees currently to fund that new growth in capital that's programmed in for 2024. We will begin to see that as we bring on the new phase, the various phases. So we don't have anything programmed in 2024 that falls outside of what we currently have in terms of anticipated revenue. Therefore, that's why we're not projecting or proposing a rate increase for the sewer license fees. But we do anticipate in future years that will come forward, but it's just not needed at this time.
Okay, that's helpful. So we will see them. Okay, and I think that's really, oh, and then the only other question I guess I have is, you mentioned, Ms. Hoffman, that looking at the tap equivalents and the sewer license fees being comparable to, we can't increase them too much to be competitive. How do we compare? Are we in the same ballpark as everyone else for our
Our
hookup?
tap
The
fees.
tap fees, yeah.
Yeah, we're probably in the 70th. I mean, I can visualize the graph of where we are. Probably like 70th percentile. Maybe a little bit higher than that if council moves forward on that. And again, we have to take into account what we have left. So, and that's the difficulty of comparing any of our surrounding communities, because all of our footprints look so vastly different. And so just to give council and the community a point as well. So we are still not recovering all the costs across the board. So base fees, for example, if we were to recover costs across the board from each one of the residents, we would have a set base fee of $29. Right now we're charging $14.50. We're recommending going to $16.41. And again, it's the threshold of balancing each one of these fees, if you will. So that not one of these enterprise funds compensates more than the rest of them. But again, everything is relative.
Okay, thank you. That is all the questions I have.
All right, thank you. Any other council member questions? You guys okay? Any questions? Councilmember Henkel?
Just both me and Councilmember Cohen we were talking about after your slide, talking about the mobile home area. That number seemed really large, and I'm just wondering, generally in those mobile home areas, it's counting the whole area just because the whole property is owned by that one property owner. And I just want to make sure that that's very clear to the public. And I'm assuming that that's because it was a large number, and Todd and I were going, oh, man.
No, thank you for the opportunity to clarify, Councilmember Hinkle. Yes, that is correct. So mobile homes are owned, they are individually billed. Those units are individually billed, unlike an apartment complex, for example, that individual person would have an account with the city and county of Broomfield. In a mobile home area, you have the property owner that supplies that, and then they charge their rate to that individual for that mobile home. So that is specifically related to the entire area, not for an individual.
Okay, thank you for saving us from having a heart attack over that. Thank you. I know we have this discussion every year, and so I just deeply appreciate the ability to reassess these water rates every year. I will agree with a lot of what Councilmember Lim was, saying that it's going to look larger to a lot of people. And I appreciate the programs that we're offering for those who need extra help. Obviously, a lot of people know that I help refugees, and so a lot of our refugee families are affected. And in particular, any families that are just, if they're not in income aligned housing. And I think We hear a lot from residents if they can or can't afford something. And so I appreciate the programs that we have here. And I'm looking forward to hearing even more detail about that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from council? Well, I guess that's it. We'll move on. Thank you so much again, Ms. Ritchie, Mr. Rutt, and the whole team. We appreciate all the work you put into this. The final agenda item this evening, we
Mayor-
have a full house for it, is
Can
an
I-
opportunity for city council members to ask questions relating to the 2024
Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt.
budget. What?
There's no vote tonight, but taking direction from council to draft an ordinance that would have to come on first and second reading when we do the budget. Am I understanding that we are moving forward on an ordinance?
Yes,
Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. I forgot to.
No, that's fine.
give you Direction. Awesome. Moving on. So council was provided the 2024 budget packet on September 7th, 2023. Presentations and recordings were included in the packet from each department, providing an overview of their departmental budget requests for 2024. We hope council has had the opportunity to review these recordings. Although there's not a staff presentation this evening, the department heads and leadership team are available to answer council member questions. I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to kick off our discussion this evening. Thank you.
We're going to start with bloopers, a reel from everybody. No, just kidding. No, I can tell you though, that I know that some of them took up to 17 takes to complete them. So as I look out over this crowd, I'm humbled by this team every day. Yep. I'm just not going to say anything else. I'm just going to mic drop it with that. And it's so great to see everybody. And we're here for council questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Hoffman. All right, who would like to go first? Councilmember Ward, you had your hand half up.
Oh.
Okay. Councilmember Henkel, you're first.
Thank you, Mayor. I did go through all the videos and every year, I'm just more and more impressed with you all. And some of you even include other staff in your videos and it is just very succinct. So I'm going to try to also be very succinct. We'll see how I do about that. I just wrote myself some questions today, though. I did have a question for PD. Just if you would mind walking me through just a little bit about your co-responder program, how that's grant funded, right? And I know you guys mentioned it during your budget review. I'm curious as to, I think the hours are from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Would you just explain a little bit more detail about that grant?
Good evening, everyone. Anaya Hempelman, Chief of Police. So the grant, as a matter of fact, I don't have all the paperwork in front of me, but it's about $350,000. We just recently renewed it. We have 3 co-responders. They work approximately 10 to 8, depending on the day of the week. Right now, we actually have an opening because one of the co-responder, one of the counselors took another job somewhere else. So we are testing for that position. Commander Mike Svila leads that program and we have great success with the program. As I've mentioned previously, the biggest thing about that program is if they're not on duty, that we do conduct follow-up the next morning. The co-responders who work in the daytime will follow up with the families and the people who need the help.
Okay, so if there's a need for a co-responder, let's say at 9 p.m., you guys notify them the next
Yep.
day as to what happened and then they'll follow up the next day.
Yes, so we have a process. We code the call. We call it Adam 99, and that gets printed out and that gets assigned to the co-responder in the morning to follow up.
Okay. Okay, so I have a question. This is sort of dealing with both you guys and the Department of Health. And So I noticed too, I think it's great that we're hiring more people. Not necessarily great the reason why, because we have to do the opioid assessments. And I feel like that's, a difficult part of the work that you guys have to do.
Sure.
You guys are also social workers as well, quite often. I understand the work to a certain degree. But do we have any sort of incoming intergovernmental funds from our Health and Human Services to spend on the opioid settlement? I know that we are our own region and we can kind of oversee where the opioid money is being spent. That's one of the great reasons. I love being a city and county, is that we can be our own region and be more nimble with that. Is there any way that we could lessen the burden on increasing, PD payments and move some of that opioid settlement funding over to PD?
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Hinkle and Jason Balling, Director of Public Health. So we came before council with the opioid settlement agreement. And it's an 18-year agreement. For Broomfield, we are receiving approximately $4 million over that 18-year period. As part of the agreement, we had to set up a regional advisory council with voting members that direct how those funds should be spent. And we've been very intentional of looking at the state portfolio of funding streams. And then secondly, having the committee and lived experience of individuals that have gone through this experience of what's needed. So we've really tried to balance those needs. And I would say one thing we're very cognizant is, even with that $4 million, you divide that over 18 years, you're looking at $200,000. So trying to adequately spend it on impact in prevention, intervention, and treatment. And then the other thing is making sure that we have sustainability of the programs as well. So some of these settlements, they're all on different timeframes. And so one will end after 14 years and another one after 7 years. We want to make sure if we're starting up programs, we don't have to go back and cut those programs. So we're allowed to carry forward a reserve if we don't spend all of the money. All of that being said, if there is a request and a need from PD or B Corps to look at expanding, we'd have to bring it to that committee and have the discussion there.
Okay, thank you. And I'm wondering, yeah, I was just wondering if we could just sort of look at that program and see if we can fund more of the PD efforts. And if we can look at that, if that regional committee, is that what they're called? The committee? Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. So absolutely, we could look at it. I mean, Chief and I were just talking about this before, and we want to be very intentional of how we do that too, of expanding and making sure that we're aware of what's the oversight that's needed, what's the actual cost, what's the potential impact to the other programs or funding. So
Yeah.
it'll be we want to go through a thoughtful process of making that request if we go forward.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Yeah, I just thought if we could move that money over, I'm wondering if we could extend the co-responder program to add more hours, particularly if we need them more on site in those off hours between the 8 PM and the 10 AM where we don't have them on duty. And, let be less on the PD side for those co-responder on those calls. So just something to think about. I would like to see that. I would like to see an expansion of our co-responder program. And I know it's really hard to find mental health experts as well. And so I realize that as well. So thank you. I think that's all for you too. And then Parks and Rec, I'm wondering through your presentation, I really appreciate the details in it. I know that Director Shuck was talking about critical deficiencies. Would you mind defining what those critical deficiencies are?
Thank you, Councilmember Hinkle. Clay Shuck, Director of Operations. Good evening, everyone. When we look at critical deficiencies or critical breakdowns within our infrastructure, it could be structures within the parks, sidewalks along the parks, an underpass, anything of that nature that we would have to take care of immediately.
Okay, great. And I noticed a lot on your budget, we're talking about signage. I know the baseball fields, could you just go a little bit more in detail about those? That looked like to be a higher budget item. Is it for the baseball fields?
The one down here that we just did?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're trying to go through our signage inventory currently and try to upgrade some of the signs that are failing. So some of those signs have been in place for many years and just need to be replacement. They're kind of at their end of the life cycle.
Okay. Just some feedback just from some of the residents. They would also like signage like on the fields. I know that some people are trying, and this might save you a headache too. Trying to get on our fields where we don't want them on our fields because we're liable for what happens if something goes wrong on our fields. They didn't ask for the permit or something like that. Do we have any plans for signage to let people know that there's a permit process to use our fields in certain circumstances?
We do have that signage up at some of our larger parks. We don't have it at every park. And it's not on every park rule sign. But it is within our rules when they do go on and look for reservations or look for parks to use. It is on the website and does define that they need a permit for large groups.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. And I think that's it for you. Let's see here. I would like to thank our attorney's office. We have had a past need for a lot of contractual attorneys. So I really appreciate the fact that we're lessening that amount for our contractual attorneys. And I don't foresee we're going to need a whole lot in the success of Pat Gilbert winning that case on the Colorado Supreme Court on a taxation case during a COVID issue. That was really amazing. I loved watching that too as well. Yep. And then debt service bonds remain steady. Will we see an increase after 2024?
I'm sorry, an increase in
Debt service bonds?
only going down.
Okay. I think I like that answer. And then capital improvements, I noticed that the budget has decreased by $61 million with a 33 decrease in spending. Can we speak to the capital improvements and that and why that's going down?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Hinkle, Brenda Ritchie, CFO. In terms of the reason the capital has gone down, it's applying the philosophy and the reprioritization and applying those mandate critical obligation buckets, if you will. It's that philosophy of planning and phasing our capital projects to when they're actually going to be coming through. So that's why you'll see a shift in funding. We saw that with the 23 revised budget as well, that we'll also see in 24. So it's really trying to better align what projects do we anticipate coming forward in terms of 2024. So that's why there's a shift in funding there.
Okay,
overall.
thank you. And the fiduciary funds increased by 51 million with an increase in 29%. Do you mind going into more detail about that one too?
Sure, that is related, just as a reminder, our fiduciary funds are pass through. So they are for example, property tax that we collect on behalf of other entities. So property tax bill, we provide the notice, and we collect all of the funds. However, Broomfield doesn't retain all of those funds. We collect on behalf of the special districts such as fire, the school districts. So what we do is it's actually a pass through. The other component of the fiduciary funds are our pensions and related to that. So the main increase we're seeing is related to the 2024 assessed valuations that we anticipate in revenue. So we will be collecting on behalf of those under other entities. Therefore, there's an increase in revenue as well as expenditure as it is a pass through.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's about it for now. I just wanted to just really again congratulate our staff. You guys have done an amazing job and just really thinking outside of the box and just I could tell you guys are really listening to your own staff, listening to the needs of what they need. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
Let's see, start with Parks and Rec. This is another case of things not paying for itself. That conversation continues. So it's obvious that the revenue for the rec centers don't pay for themselves. So I looked at let's see, in 2023, we have $350,000 expected for rental of facilities, just slightly more in 2024, 375,000. Do those numbers meet that's for BCC. So do those numbers meet our expectations from when we built the facility? Did we anticipate that we would have greater rental income from those, from BCC?
I think we did initially as we were coming out of COVID, though we just weren't quite sure how the popularity of the facility was going to be and are people willing to come back. Last year, we started to see a little bit of an increase. So far this year, we're starting to see a much greater trend of people wanting to rent the facility for weddings, receptions. We've got a number of sports groups that are coming in to do their end of the season type of parties. So we're definitely seeing it trend up.
Okay, that's good news, certainly, because we don't want to have to raise the fees if it's not necessary, but obviously it doesn't balance individually on those rec centers. So, yeah.
No, it doesn't. The rec center, and I think the recreation in general, if you look across the nation, is usually subsidized out of the general fund. So typically it's around 39% on a national average, 35 to 39%. I think this year we're looking at about 64%.
Great. Anecdotally, I did just talk to a Ward 3 resident who expressed extreme appreciation for the rec facility. He was taking care of someone who had an older woman who had serious illness, and he just came up to me and he said, "The rec center is saving me." I mean, he's swimming all the time, and he said, "It's keeping me going in this situation he's in." So that was wonderful to hear.
Yep.
But it's an amenity. It's costly.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Pavement maintenance. So we're doubling the budget from 4 million to 8 million from 2023 to 2024. There was a statement that we need to treat 10% annually to keep up with our maintenance as we should, so we don't have any further deterioration. How will we judge that doubling of the budget has kept our goal, has met our goal to treat 10% annually? There's a lot of resident interest in our pavement maintenance. So how would a resident be able to track if we are meeting our goals there and doubling that budget?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Lim. Basically, how we evaluate the streets, we have a computerized maintenance program, especially designed for street evaluations. So we evaluate all the streets every year within the city and county of Broomfield, and then they get a rating. And then based on that rating, we develop a plan of action to address the worst streets first, and then the best streets to keep them best, right? So we don't want them to deteriorate. So we track all that. It's on our webpage, and we'll update the map as we go through with the service each month.
Okay, great. So there's something online that residents can track. That's great. Economic vitality. There's some interest among some residents about our new catalytic development. Now that we have 4, the 4th one is the First Bank Center. That's the addition. Could you describe how that the council decision impacts our short-term 2024 budget and our longer-term budget for prospects in future years?
Thank you. And I may call on City and County Manager Hoffman to help me out a little bit in case I don't have the complete picture. Mayor, council members. So in the short term, again, as many of you know, Borough actually owns the First Bank Center, what we're soon to be calling the Broomfield Event Center as it closes down, but the Broomfield Event Center. So some of the funding that we're going to be required to do some of the work, as well as maintain that facility while we're going through the owner due diligence, will be coming through the borough budgets. And so you'll see that as one of the budget supplements coming forward later this year for the 2023, and then how we look at 2024. Now that we've established that, now the councils and borough has established that as the path. Going forward, our intent is to move as expeditiously as possible toward both the potential reconsideration, reinvestment, or redevelopment of that center, as well as the additional 12 acres that were constricted due to the overflow parking requirements. So that land is actually owned by the city and county of Broomfield. And so we'll be moving forward with that in the same manner with an owner due diligence process right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. See, I had the opportunity to stop by Coffee with a Cop on 287 this morning. Thank you to the police department for the large number of officers who were there to greet the public, and thank you to the public for turning out. There was conversation there, at least from the what I heard of in summary from some of the people, that there was interest in the catalytic converters. There was interest in the car theft statistics. So Chief, could you address how the budget is trying to increase the police ability to address property crime in that manner?
Absolutely. So in our budget, we are requesting 4 sergeants, 2 officers, as well as an investigative aide, if you saw that in there without going through the whole budget. And of course, as we add staffing, that's just going to help us be more proactive, more police presence. We always say we can't confirm if we're preventing crime when we're driving through because there's not a way to collect that data, but we know that our presence may deter someone from committing a crime. So we're hoping by adding the staff, specifically the investigative aid, we've never had that here in Broomfield, and we're hoping that it will assist the detectives so that they can spend more time focusing on talking to victims and doing the follow-up and not do the very time-consuming stuff like sitting and watching surveillance videos for hours, for example, from an incident that happened. So we've asked for that specific position to help the detectives, and then we've asked for the additional staffing on the road.
Great. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. Just one quick question as it relates to the development agreement funds that's listed on page 8 of the 2024 CIP PDF that you guys sent out last week. I understand the Flatiron Crossing and the Mace Rich ones because those are relative to Flatirons Mall. What is the Flatirons Marketplace, that repayment to the Metro District along with the Mid-Cities Main Street payment to the Metro District? Can you kind of explain, either Manager Hoffman or
Miss Ritchie
of staff?
is finding that page in line right now. I know. I lost her. She's
hiding.
She's hiding.
It's been a long day.
And it's right after the right after the developer reimbursements. Yeah, it's pretty steady. Yeah, it's 242,000.
Yeah, the Flatirons Marketplace for estimated 2024 is 257 roughly, and then Mid-Cities is roughly 2.8 million.
I'll tell you what, give us a couple of minutes to find that, and you want to move on to your next question?
That
We'll
is
come right back to
totally
you.
fine with me. And then let me go scroll down to this page real quick. A point of a clarification question, more or less. On page 11, under the landscaping projects, it says the Lamar Street and US 287 island improvements. I was always under the impression that CDOT was responsible for any state or US highway in terms of maintenance and all the accoutrements. Is that correct?
Katie Allen, I'm making eye contact with you because you have not come to the podium tonight. And what would a meeting be without something from Miss Allen?
Thank you. I may not be the best person to answer this question because I don't do the maintenance agreements, but yeah, I would like to try. My understanding from the projects that I have done in the past is that landscaping in particular is maintained by Broomfield. So if we want to enhance the medians on a state highway with landscaping, then we would have to maintain that.
Okay. Do we know what exactly is necessary in that particular median? I haven't driven or ridden by it in a while, and not being a landscaping professional, I wouldn't want to speak as to the.
Teamwork makes the dream work. Here comes Mr. Shuck.
Good evening again, Clay Shuck, Director of Operations. Yeah, there are a lot of areas that we do landscaping in the right of way, and this is one of them. What the exact plan is, I don't have off the top of my head, but I can get back to you on that.
Okay, that's fine. And then Manager Hoffman, I know you and I have talked about this probably more than you would like, but I'm going to keep bringing it up because I feel the need to.
Tell me.
Emerald Lane.
Yes.
On the other side of the tracks.
Yes. You had me at, I knew right where you were going.
I figured I would.
Yes.
I know in the CIP list, the total list, 51 roughly 51 transportation project.
53.
53.
Mhm.
Thank you. It's not listed on the 5-year plan. It's listed as beyond the current plan.
Mhm.
And that particular road in Broomfield, for residents that don't know, is the only unpaved road in the city and county of Broomfield. And since 2017, residents have been asking, and they were required to submit a petition by this previous city and county management wanted that. They were
Sure.
told 2020 it would be paid, and then it got pushed, and it's been pushed and pushed and pushed.
Sure.
And I ask because at what point are we going to stop making them jump through hurdles and continue to question when is this road that's not paved in a city and county that has every other road paved going to get paved?
I would love to tell you that accommodations can be made. But I'm not going to tell you that. What I am going to tell you is that we have a multidisciplinary staff that built an equity model. And there's equal and there's equity, and they are two very different things. So we are well aware that it is not a paved road. We understand that the 7 residents really want a paved road. It's a $500,000 price tag to pave that road. And it's number 53 out of 53. So when all things are put into that model and it's generated to the 53 spot, it doesn't fall into the 3 buckets, right? Mandated, obligated, and critical nature. So it really, it's a want. And from a funding perspective, as unpopular as it is, and I appreciate you continuing to bring it up and advocate for your folks. I truly do. And we will continue to go back. Does the future look bright to have that done? If council wants to have the conversation about what doesn't happen in order for that to happen, staff is absolutely open to that.
Okay, thank you. And I keep bringing it up because they were told in 2017, you have to do this. You were promised in 2020, we were going to get this done. And in their view, continuing to break that promise, it creates this level of distrust with the city and county of Broomfield. If we're not going to uphold a promise either we should have level set with them right from the get-go that it's not going to happen.
Sure.
Or we fulfilled the promise, but I will digress on that point for right now. And it also speaks to a larger perspective in the rest of Ward 2, particularly the Interlochen Via Vara area, where you have unsettling of the road base, which is causing large cracks. I mean, 1-2 inches of pavement peeling apart. Undulations that feel like a roller coaster when you come off of US 36 eastbound into the Flatirons Mall area from East Flatiron Crossing.
Sure.
And I think for a lot of residents, particularly in Ward 2, that equity lens is hard for them to swallow. Not necessarily because they don't agree with equity, but I mean, we keep looking at scores and they look at their roads and go, I don't see how this happens when we go through the rest of Broomfield. And in my honest opinion, the rest of Broomfield does not have the same types of roads that are in Interlochen in Via Vara. So I just wanted to really hammer home that point with 6 seconds left. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you. Councilmember Marshall.
Thank you, Mayor. I have some specific budget or department questions, but also just general ones. And I'm actually going to start with the general one going off of Councilmember Ward, the borough budget, 120 specifically.
Yes.
We, going off the equity thing, I don't see in the budget. And I know we've borrowed money from the borough for the First Bank Center.
35 million.
Yeah. And I understand that borrowing is used loosely, it's not being paid back. But we have a large amount of, on 120th, we have stretches that have no sidewalks. Or bad landscaping, medians. I'm not sure about the medians on just to the west of Sheridan, whether or not that is our responsibility or not. But I guess can we talk about a little bit about what's the plan for beautification along the southern border of Broomfield?
So again, the next 2 budget cycles were focused on obligation and mandates and critical needs. And as difficult as it is to continue to come back to that budget conversation, that's just exactly the budget conversation we need to come back to. So well, from a conversation about a beautification, if it doesn't fit in those buckets and we're from a development perspective in partnership with the developer, much like what's coming, Mr. Romine, when is the Chevy dealership coming? Am I supposed to ask that on in public? Too late?
No, as you know, council has approved all of it. It is going through. They're moving forward on their construction now, and you'll start seeing that starting to happen. And we would anticipate an opening of the new dealership which is just to the west, roughly in about, we'll call it a little over a year. If I could, perhaps maybe I can answer a little bit. So I'm gonna, if I could, do two answers. First, one to you, council member, and then one to council member Ward's question earlier that we wanted to get back to. So first off is the borough budget, of course, is separate. And within every urban renewal area, there is a service plan that is required. So what you'll be seeing coming forward later in early in 2024 is a adjustment to the 120th borough. That's part of the Broomfield Town Square activities that we talked about a few weeks ago. So as the service plan begins to come forward, there is an opportunity to begin to rethink what we do with the 120th, the remaining part of the 120th. What is planned right now, what we have worked and city county manager, we've been doing so many different things lately that perhaps this one slipped a little bit back in everybody's minds. But one of the things that Ms. Burton-Zetti and I have been pushing is a consideration of the 120th area and what we think about that. So that is on our work plans for roughly a year from now, year and a half, just think about that plan. And that's what would then inform a future service plan for the 120th area, to your point about what the improvements might be on the Broomfield side. So that's on the Broomfield side. Of course, the other side of 120th is in our sister city, Westminster, to the south.
So I'm going to push back a little bit, and not on what you said, actually on what Ms. Hoffman said.
Please.
There are stretches of 120th. There's vacant lots.
Yes.
There's an existing establishment where there's no sidewalks. Greenway Park, that stretch is Broomfield on both sides. There's no sidewalk there. To me, safety of pedestrians is a critical need. So I guess as far as the buckets is concerned, that's how I would define critical need. So I guess without those things, could those things be addressed in the borough update that you're talking about, or?
So Katie's come up, which tells me that I'm going to
Yeah.
defer to Katie. But I may come back after Katie gives you the specific answer also.
And the vacant lot I'm speaking of, we all know what I'm talking about, the sidewalks are broken pretty much and it's not safe.
So I wanted to answer the sidewalk part, not really the beautification. I just wanted to mention that we have two capital projects currently underway. One is under construction for sidewalks on the south side of 120th from Teller to Three Margaritas. And then we also have a federally funded project, which is, because it's federally funded, is taking a little longer through the planning and design and clearance process. And that is to do missing gaps along 120th for the rest of Broomfield, with some caveats, not in certain areas that have near-term development planned. But so that project is underway. I think we'll be going to bid in 2024.
And that's proposed to complete all the sidewalks along that way?
Yes, except for where there's one, soonly planned by development to pay for.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. On the police, on staying in Ward
Well,
one,
if I
sorry,
could-
go ahead. Yeah.
If I could, I just wanted to answer Council Member Ward's question. Sorry, I'm not using your time, but we did want to get back to it.
course.
And Council Member Ward, so the Flatirons Marketplace, which is the former development. So that originally had a development agreement dating back to 1998 when it originally came forward. There was a revision to that as we saw the redevelopment. And again, that was becoming a very blighted area. And so we re-entered in. And so part of that is the sales tax and property tax that is being provided to the Metro District for some of the improvements that they've made. That is an ongoing agreement, and it is something I would just remind you, as well as everyone else, part of that revision of that, or that redevelopment that's occurring at that site, also is bringing forward 15% of the units as affordable. So while we did give some additional, we did continue in certain ways with some of that funding, we also did get additional outcomes for it from that. So if I just wanted to follow up on that question.
Actually, Mr. Roman, I do have a follow-up on that. In 3A, it mentions the development agreements fund of $17 million, 17.8. Does that, we've had conversations in the past about there's a lot of business development agreements that we didn't know what was in them.
Yep.
Does that $17 million account for all of those?
So if I could, and then I'll let the manager hop in.
And
finish
follow up
up.
for that, do we have a repository somewhere where all of those agreements are that we can look at?
So roughly 2 years ago, at Manager Hoffman's direction and insistence and guidance, all three of those are the appropriate terms for what we did. We did dig into an awful lot of them. Sometimes what we refer to as development agreements include annexation agreements and other things. So there's not necessarily a price tag related to those, but those are some of the things that have been talked about in that long list of CIP projects. The development agreements we're talking about there are the agreements such as you've seen with Broomfield Town Square that was approved in 2019, as well as the agreement that was approved roughly 2 years ago on Flatirons Crossing. So that those monies, Brenda's behind me, but those are the types of monies we're talking about. Some of those other things that came through in a annexation agreement formally wouldn't be necessarily in that funding. So that's the clarification. Manager Hoffman, I don't know if you want to add anything more.
I was just, and not being tongue in cheek about it, but it literally took 2 years to peel back each one of those layers of the onion. Are we confident that we have all of them? We're confident that we have all of the development agreements. And is it an overstatement, Mr. Romine, to say the inventory includes 90% of what we think we're going to be responsible for, if not right now, certainly in the near future?
So I would agree with that estimate. The problem with when you don't know what the full N is, it's hard to say what portion of the N is. But we believe we've found almost all of them. And we've dug in back 30 years pretty deeply.
And do we have a listing of where we can where council, when the public can find those agreements, or like a counting of all of them?
You know, we have a spreadsheet that we could certainly share. It's been as Mr. Romine had stated, it's not as simple as having a business development agreement, right? There are amendments, adjustments. It's a rabbit hole for sure. Yeah. Brenda,
If I may add to that,
please.
we do, in the distribution memo that council received and that's available to the public, we have a document called budget tables. Table 19 is where you'll want to look for the financial implications. Again, it's not a comprehensive list related to the annexation, but it does have an accounting of all of the agreements and disbursements that we have planned and programmed. And as mentioned, Mr. Romine mentioned that Flatirons agreement. That's also part of that 1998. So we're working to kind of update that, but that is within table 19 of the budget tables.
I appreciate that. I must have overlooked that in the 1,000-page of documents.
Yeah.
Okay, one question for the police department. In Ward 1, we've had a bunch of concerns regarding code compliance. And I think one of the concerns that residents have voiced to me is that since it's complaint based, some things go on taken care of for a long period of time because nobody calls. And I understand that that's residents' responsibility to do that. But it seems like the sense of some residents that they would like more patrols, I guess, is the question. And I know we only have one compliance officer that's for that region. I didn't see an additional officer in here for that. Is that something we've looked at?
Sure, our code compliance is not only complaint-based, they also do proactive compliance. We actually have 3 code compliance officer and a supervisor who are proactively in the neighborhood.
Do we need an additional, given the level of complaints or residents concerned, do we need an additional one?
No, if we need an additional one, I definitely would have put that in our budget.
Okay, thank you. And then I have just a general question. That's something that's I didn't see, and maybe I overlooked it again. But last year council decided not to enroll the Broomfield in the FMLI program. Something that I believe we have to readdress this year. Is the potential expenditure for that in the budget, or is it something that would have to be added later if we?
Here comes Ms. Macklin.
Good evening. When we opted out, we actually are opted out for 8 years. Unless we take action, we could certainly opt in. And so the agreement was, it just automatically guarantees us without having to have a vote every year. So that original vote would carry for 8 years.
That's not how I remember it last year. I thought it was only just for 1 year.
We certainly can revisit each year and we can choose to opt back in. It's just that initial opt out carries without requiring any additional action. So the agreement was that I would come back to council with a recommendation as to what to do for 2024. And that's on the agenda for November 14th, I believe, without looking at the calendar.
Okay, thank you. So if at that time council decided to opt in, we'd have to make a budget amendment to.
Correct.
We would, I think the original budget was 824,000 and we didn't
880, I think, yeah.
880, and we didn't want to encumber those funds.
And then one other, I think, strategic initiatives. At the April study session, council, I thought gave pretty clear direction to move forward with the single hauler trash system. And I know we're waiting on the RFP right now, or not even, we're going, but I saw that study session suggested that we would need 3 FTEs for to implement that program. And I don't see any additional FTEs in the budget. So is that something that we're waiting to maybe 25 to implement, or how's that working?
Thank you, Danae Brillier, Director of Strategic Initiatives, Mayor, council members. Councilmember Marsh-Holsham, that's a great question. So the reason is we're in the next phase of that journey. So we'll be bringing forward a memo for council's consideration to approve the request for proposals, which is the next step in that journey in October. If we get direction to proceed, then we'll move forward with that request. And then it will take another approval from council in April of next year of the contracts. And at that time, we'll know cost, we'll know impact. And at that time, we'll decide if a budget request is needed. The earliest we see that impact is 2025. And so we didn't want to encumber the funds right now. We'll make that decision once we know more in 2024.
Okay, thank you. And then a question for parks, and I guess this goes to sustainability and water also. This year there was a pilot program to xeriscape a portion of Brandywine Park, which I don't believe has been completed yet. Is that something we're looking at the moment?
Mr. Shuck, while you're waiting for Brandon, can you give the answer on the Lamar Street medians, please?
Yes. So the project, Councilmember Ward, for the Lamar Street medians are to replace the existing landscaping with landscaping that requires less watering. It also will enhance some of the pedestrian crossings in those areas. It's not in full design yet, so we don't have all the specifics.
Thank you.
You bet.
Good evening. Yeah, thank you for the question on the Brandywine pilot project. That is certainly something that is currently ongoing. So the first step in that project was to put together conceptual plans for what that conversion might look like. So we worked directly with the Parks Department to finalize those plans. The next step is we have a company going out to the site this month to conduct an audit of the existing irrigation system. And from there, they'll be able to recommend the irrigation system retrofits that are necessary for that conversion. And the third phase of that will be then to cost out the conversion and do a cost benefit analysis. So basically compare the long-term water savings to the cost of purchasing the landscaping materials and retrofitting the irrigation system. So I'd say I think the tentative timeline for that project is to have it wrapped up in the early part of 2024.
Okay, thank you. And on that same subject, have we looked in our long-range CIP of a plan to do that for all non-use turf in Broomfield? I think Thornton has been moving forward with a plan on theirs. So to replace as much of our non-usable turf.
Yeah, so the Brandywine project is a specific parcel pilot project, but then we're also looking at a large scale analysis of what would be the high-end water savings if we were to convert all non-functional turf within the city and county to more xeric or native landscaping. So that'll give us a sense of what is the greatest amount of water savings we could expect from a large scale program. So until we have those results, we've kind of held off on securing any funding. So I think the next step is to wrap up that analysis, and then Water Resources and Parks will work together to come up with a funding plan. The nonprofit we're working with on that study, though, is also looking into various outside funding mechanisms from the state, or whether it be federal grants, to help fund those conversions. So we're going to look at some creative ways to fund those projects moving forward.
Great, thank you. And then one more general question for City Manager Hoffman. Everybody's favorite topic is the property tax assessments. The increase that we're anticipating to receive off of that, is that included in this budget?
It is not.
So when we look at the property, whatever line it is, the property tax revenue, that amount, the additional amount is not included in this?
It's included, but it's not programmed. So that amount, because we have to account for it, but it's not been programmed. So in other words, how to spend those funds has not been a topic of discussion. And primarily because we don't know what that amount is. So we know what the assessed valuation is. Again, and to Ms. Ritchie's point, Broomfield keeps 23%, I think is so a lot of numbers going on tonight. 23%. And the rest we pass through. So from an estimation perspective, we want to ensure that if HH goes through, and if 303 and 304 go through, we want to make sure that we're not anticipating any of those additional funds.
And I guess my question then is that I expected to see $12 million more revenue than we did in expenses, but I'm looking at the budget and it's a balanced budget, which it's supposed to be, and that's great that it is.
Yeah.
But I guess I kind of expected to see a pot of $12 million that was not budgeted for.
Ms. Ritchie?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. Happy to answer that question. It is in the expenditure. So if you look at the ending fund balance for 2024, you will see in the county funds, because we collected through the county. So Fund 02, you will see, and I don't know the top of my head, but it's quite a large balance. I want to say 15 roughly. But that 12 million is part of that. So therefore it's not expended. It's calculated as part of the incoming revenues within that general fund of the county funds, and it's not expended. So therefore you'll see the ending fund balance contains that.
I do see that the beginning balance of the county is 10,000,005 and the ending is 16,900.
Okay.
But the overall beginning balance is 281, the ending balance is 271. So the end of the overall city and county budget is $10 million less than what we were beginning with, according to 1A.
So that would be, so the beginning fund balance, so looking specifically just for the property tax revenue that's collected in 2024, that would be part of the Fund 2 ending fund balance. And I'd be happy to send an email that with the chart actually showing that where it's being held and that it's not being expended. So we are collecting those revenues and setting those aside in anticipation for any changes that might come with the legislation, and have not programmed that, as Ms. Manager Hoffman indicated. It's being held so there are no programmed expenditures at this time.
And I want to add,
Revenues
Councilmember
haven't
Marshall.
been collected though.
They have not been collected. So again, so we all need to keep in mind that a budget is a plan, right? It's that budget alters, but from our fiduciary duty, if we know something's coming in, and we don't know what it is, it's a placeholder essentially. And it's really important to add the appeals that were approved through BOE from those assessed valuations, that comes out of those funds. And that's to the tune of, Ms. Ritchie, if memory serves me, 7 million.
That's correct. Between city and county and borough funds, we're estimating in appeals.
So that amount would come right off of that top.
Okay. All right.
Thus, that's why you don't want to program those funds.
All right,
Right,
thank
that's all I have,
you.
Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Shaft.
Thank you, Mayor. So, in the last few years, we've had a lot of philosophical changes that have happened. And again, we continue that philosophical change this year. I truly do believe that we're moving in the right direction to a more fiscally sound and responsible organization. So I thank you and I thank all of you for your continued work. One of the greatest resources, of the city and county of Broomfield is our staff. It's not just me that says this. It's the residents that I talk to. I continue to hear from residents on a regular basis that they have fond stories to tell me of interactions that they've had with all of you and your teams. You do amazing work. And I thank you. And I know that our residents, through my interactions with them, continue to thank you as well. So thank you for your work. With the largest portion of our budget going toward our personnel, how have we ensured and will ensure our people are taken care of, invested in, and truly supported moving forward?
Well, a couple of different ways. Like anything else, it's a multi-pronged approach. We started, so thank you, Councilmember Schaaf, first of all. We are grateful to hear that. The appreciation, it goes a long way. We started 3 years ago. So Broomfield historically, not only, lean and mean and do more with less, essentially, which means on the back of the staff. So any local government, we're not in the business to make money. Obviously, it's a service organization. So historically in Broomfield and through all local governments, it's about 60% of the general fund goes to personnel. Historically, Broomfield has been 2.5 to 3 years lagging in salary. And that's again, that's just it's hard to bite that bullet and shore anything up. So the easier route is just not to do that. So at council approval and staff direction, starting 3 years ago, we started the process to shore that up. And the first component of that was from the federal guidelines, the Fair Equity Pay Act, and all of that meant. The second year, and again, this is a deep dive. We have, 1,200 employees. And so doing that line by line, it is, it's an endeavor. And again, that's why it takes anything really to do a sea change takes anywhere from 24 to 36 months. So as you know, the staff is comprehensive and we do deep dives. Last year in 2022 was the second year, which was, where are the ranges? What do ranges mean? And what is the market? We all know that when we were coming out of COVID, a lot of local governments struggled significantly for staffing. We were not immune to that, although we didn't suffer to the same extent as other communities did, primarily because of Broomfield's longstanding culture. It made a big difference. But when you're shoring up what the range looks like, then this third year, you all approved a compensation philosophy. So then you have to decide where the person is in that range. And so when the range moves, you would think it's counterintuitive because you would think that and this is for the most of these employees that are in the room, like me, have been here for 20 plus years. That third year was all about, again, line by line, position by position, and looking at education, looking at experience, and not performance, right? Because performance is in addition to that. So again, really segregating, where are you in the market? And then what does that performance piece look like? That was a big ticket item. The last 3 years have been really significant in doing that work. And I have to say that council's been very responsive in making what you just asked about come to fruition, from benefits and pay, and looking at that kind of comprehensive whole. And that includes personal and professional development and training. So organizational development has become important. So we all know that pay is in the top 5, but it's not in the top 2. But it's certainly in the top 5. So if we can hit each one of those on those top 5s, then everybody has a choice to make. So I think ensuring that we stay updated on salary, on benefits, on outcome, we stay updated on training, we stay updated in our sweet spot, which is our managers and our supervisors for any organization. It's really about that mid piece and making sure that the culture is one of we ask a lot of our employees in Broomfield. The bar is consistently high, and So when we say we bleed blue, we fundamentally, we mean it. And 75% of our employees are Broomfield residents, or 80%. There's just so many numbers going on right now. Abby, what is that number? I think it's right around there. Somebody's going to check for me real quick, just so we can be validated with the number. So, you know, again, I think it's being mindful, and we're seeking to improve that. And I think, you know, embedding, you know, our access and development and equity and inclusion makes a big difference, because the folks that we have here on our teams and the ones that we're bringing on, it's important to them. That is, and we hear it pretty consistently. I know that was a long diatribe. I'm sorry. I'm just, yeah.
No, thank you for
Just
sharing that,
our-
because I think it's important. I think it's, you know, when we're talking about 60% of the budget, you know, it's a very important piece, and you know, with all of our employees, I mean, you had talked about salary is a top 5, but it's not a top 2. But one of those, you know, top reasons is, does your work matter? Does it make a difference? And, you know, the stories I hear, they do make a difference. You all make a difference in this community and in these, you know, the residents and employees that work in Broomfield's lives. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal to me, and I know that the residents I talk to, it's a big deal to them. So thank you for that. To get down into the nitty gritty. So thanks for the big question. Down to the nitty gritty.
Yes.
There was a large expansion of public art in Broomfield in the last 2 years. I get you know, a lot of questions. I get a lot of comments about it. But according to the budget, this will drop off significantly in terms of the new public art that will be added. Will we see less public art added in the next year, or is this just a budgeting piece?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to phone a friend. And here she comes,
And
this lineup.
And while you're walking to the podium, I have a follow-up question that I'll just put out there now. The maintenance budget, is that sufficient to maintain? Because we've talked a lot about that we have to maintain those assets that we already have. And is that budget, it's less than the maintenance budget that we had this last year. Is it a sufficient amount to continue to maintain that large influx of public art that we've had over the last year?
Thank you for that question, Councilmember Schaaf. Catherine Lineup, Director of Library Arts History and Extension. And with our public art funding, that is coming from a portion of CIP funds. We've had some extra that we were able to expend because of some carryovers. Part of that was the Public Art Committee was holding some money in order to be able to put something iconic with the town square. But the town square folks have their own public art budget. And so they made the decision in the last couple of years to go ahead and free up some of that money and do some additional projects with that money, and also some smaller scale projects, mostly because the amount of staff time it takes and to make sure we're getting the art out there. We're just finding different ways to do that. So moving forward, we're working with 9 Dot Arts right now on a public art plan in order as our city grows out, that funding for public art will slow down. So they're helping us with a plan so that we have something sustainable to move forward. So it's not like as we've built out, public art kind of stops and we're stuck with what we've got. So that's what we're working on right now. So there is some fluctuation that you are seeing. As far as maintenance goes, that is something new that we added to actually have some of those funds directly spent on maintaining. It is sufficient for now, but that is one thing that we are also having them look at so that we have a good plan for that. As you know, we didn't used to have
a plan for deaccessioning art too, because art has a lifespan. And you don't necessarily always want to try to maintain art that may have gone out of style or whatever the case is. So that's a plan we're also working on with the committee.
Great. Thank you for the answer. That's all the questions I have, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
I just have one question here to ask, and appreciate the information on properties and HH and the tax revenue, because I was going to ask about that. Okay, in the Anthem Community Park, we built that amazing parking lot, but not the ball fields and the tennis courts and the other pieces, and that is not showing up in the 5-year plan or anywhere that I can see. I'm just curious, what is the thought there? I know it doesn't fall in the critical bucket, but it's like, it feels like it should be somewhere in the plan. And then I have a comment about pickleball.
Clay used to love the questions about the pool, and now we send him everything regarding pickleball. Councilmember Anderson, so anytime that we go on record, it's similar to what people hear versus what's in the development agreements. Much like the Emerald Lane, right? That they were promised something when it shows, when it's reflected on a plan. Oftentimes people want to interpret that as that's a done deal. And so with the business development agreement, the reason that I say it's likened to that if we say we're going to put it in the 5-year plan, everybody that's in Anthem that's listening right now will say, remember during that budget session, you all said that it was going to go in that 5-year plan. So Clay's going to tell us about, before he tells us about pickleball, about the ball fields and Mr. Shuck.
Good evening again. Clay Shuck, Director of Operations. Thank you for the question, Councilmember Anderson. We actually have a couple more phases of the Anthem Community Project that we're looking at. We've got the finish of the parking lot, the infrastructure for the electrical, and then the final phase would be the building of the ball fields. It is outside of the 5-year plan currently, but it is a project that we're still looking at. We moved it outside the 5-year plan specifically because we were needing to reallocate some resources back to the Bay so we can get the Bay phase 4 taken care of. So that pushed that project out a little further.
But it's on the radar.
It is still on the radar. Yeah, we're not giving up on it.
Not leave the parking lot there with, okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And then I just want to share that anytime, because tennis courts are part of this plan, just want to share some information that residents, they want pickleball courts and they say 4 can fit in the place of 1 tennis court. So when this project comes up, they want to, maybe from Anthem Ranch specifically, they're interested in looking at pickleball courts if that's not outside the scope.
Hopefully within this, hopefully within the scope of this project as it moves forward, we do have a plan for some tennis courts and some pickleball courts that hopefully we're able to incorporate in this plan as we move forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
And I want to add just one last thing, and it's those operative words that everybody can't stand, and that's subject to annual appropriation. The most non-sexy, happy words that anybody can, really hear. And so again, a plan is just that, right? The budget is the plan. The 5-year plan is just that. And it really depends upon the revenue and what else is happening.
Glad it's still on the radar though. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank you all for being here tonight to answer these questions. Not to belabor the point about Emerald Lane. I drove down the road after some distraught neighbors, young families just moved into that area, that it turns into sludge after the snow melts to where my car almost got stuck. I have video. It was so bad. And so I am advocating for this $500,000 project in a budget this big. Doesn't seem that much when we could swap out some landscaping something that's not a mandate, something that's not critical, that's not a safety issue. I would be willing to go through line by line and find that money because I think it's the right thing to do. We're better than that. We should have paved roads for everyone in the city and county. And so I'm going to go to the mattresses on that. And I hope my council will support me. It is an equity issue. It is absolutely an equity issue because this sludge tracks into their homes, into their yards, into their driveways. And it's just, to me, not at the level of where we put everything else in the city and county. So I'm going to hold on that. But I do want to tell you today, I attended a groundbreaking for a new technology park called Sims Technology Park. And I met with the developers, engineers, realtors, interested tenants, and it was nothing but positive praise for our staff and what Broomfield is to them and how they noticed the difference immediately in working with our teams and with our building department and with our planning department, and just how much easier it is to get things done here. And I just want to give those props to all of you, because everywhere I go, I hear that it's different here. And we couldn't do it without our human capital. So you are the most valuable piece of this budget. And I just want to thank you all for the service you provide above and beyond every day. That concludes the agenda items for this evening's study session.